both here and watching on webcast, to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main items of business today are a question and answer session with the Mayor as the occupant of the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. and a discussion with the Director of the Violence Reduction Unit from 11 a.m. Before we begin these discussions, we have a few short items of formal business to go through. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag #AssemblyPolice. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Item 1, apologies for absence. At the plenary meeting on the 6th of February, a change to the membership of the Police and Crime Committee was agreed by the Assembly, with Tom Copley, Assembly member, appointed as a member of this committee, replacing Florence Ashalomi, MP AM. I would like to thank Florence Ashalomi, MP AM, for all her work on the committee. Members will also be notified of an updated agenda front sheet. Can I now ask our clerk, Jonathan Baker, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, apologies for absence have received from Assemblymember Copley, for whom Assemblymember Shah is substituting, and Assemblymember Dismore.
Thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2? Thank you. Can I also ask the Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? No interest? No. Thank you. Item 3, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee as listed in the report? Thank you. Item 4, action taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me and the delegated authority to agree the committee's letter on modern slavery and human trafficking in London, and note the letter as attached at Appendix 1? Noted. Thank you. So coming to item 5 now, we now move to the first of our two main items of business, which is a question and answer session with the Mayor as occupant of the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. I would like to welcome you, Mayor of London, to this meeting. And can I ask you to start off with opening statement for up to 5 minutes? And I do realize that you've got to leave at 11. So we'll try to be as disciplined as we can in getting through all our questions. And there are quite a few questions we want to ask you. So over to you.
The safety and security of Londoners is my most important responsibility as Mayor, and it's one I take extremely seriously. I welcome the fact that we have this opportunity to talk about a range of important issues. But I want to start by focusing my opening statement on one issue in particular, because I know it's something that's concerning many Londoners right now. And that's the terrible rise in violent crime we've seen since 2014 across the country, including London, and the rise in serious youth violence since 2012. Part of the solution is, of course, getting more police officers on the streets and being tough on crime. And that's why since 2016, I've taken some very difficult decisions in response to the unprecedented cuts from the government, which have left the Met Police overstretched and under-resourced. Not only have we increased council tax by the maximum amount in every single year of this mayoral term, but we've diverted additional funding from business rates to support the fight against crime. Thanks to these difficult decisions, City Hall is now providing more police funding than at any time in its history. This has helped to fund an additional 1,300 police officers, to ensure we have 600 extra police officers on the streets in the coming year, and to establish the Violent Crime Task Force, which has already taken more than 2,400 weapons off the streets and arrested over 8,000 dangerous individuals. However, as many police officers will be the first to say, we'll never be able to arrest our way out of this problem. And a key part of the equation will always be about tackling the root causes of crime. All the evidence shows that the causes of crime are deeply complex and involve poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunities for our young people. What's more, the national cuts to youth services, schools, sports facilities, and councils since 2010 have made the situation far, far worse. So my plan is about doing all we can to turn things around, given the damage caused by a decade of austerity, and about being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. As part of this comprehensive approach, I can announce today that this year will be invested an additional £55.5 million from City Hall. This will mean we can invest £25 million of new money to build on the great work of the Young Londoners Fund, which is providing positive opportunities for young Londoners and helping to steer them away from crime. This will mean we can increase funding for London's Violence Reduction Unit with new initiatives to address the underlying causes of violent crime, from ensuring fewer students are excluded from school to funding community groups to help them reduce violence in their neighbourhoods. And this will mean we can increase investment in programmes to tackle county lines and to disrupt the damaging drugs market in London. Overall, this extra investment will mean that we're using this year's City Hall's budget to provide over £100 million in additional funding to tackle violent crime. Encouragingly, there are signs that our approach, tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, is beginning to turn this tide. But I'll always be honest with Londoners, we still have a mountain to climb, and ultimately we need the government to step up too. Lastly, the events of the last year have only served to highlight the incredible job our police officers do, often in the most tragic and difficult of circumstances. So I want to take this opportunity to place on the record, once again, my thanks to our brave policemen and policewomen. We truly have the best police service in the world, which is a constant source of pride to me. And I'm sure the committee will join me in paying tribute to the police for their professionalism, their service and their bravery. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and we do join you in praising our police service for the excellent work they're doing. Can I now hand over to Assemblymember Len Duval, who will ask the first set of questions on a safer London and crime performance.
So all these issues are around performance issues. So in that sense, given that I think you first identified in your crime plan that violence was the issue that needed to be tackled, long overdue, and welcome that. Given the complexities that we face about policing in crime and your dual roles as Mayor of London, but also as Police and Crime Commissioner for London, let's talk about the performance of the MPS, performance of MOPAC, and about your contribution, the levers that you pull. And what would you, how, in terms of progress or not, against rising crime going on, what's your assessment over the last couple of years?
I think the police are working extremely hard with other agencies. I think there's probably as good multi-agency approach as there's ever been. There's usually a lag between pulling the levers and seeing a result on the ground. It's probably around 2 years in relation to seeing tangible difference. We've seen rapid progress in the last 2 years, though, as a consequence of the VIU and the public health approach that was set out in the knife crime strategy. You'll know, for example, just giving you one criteria of measurement, knife crime injuries to under 25s. We saw over the last year a decrease of that of about almost 10%. Over 2 years, a decrease of 23%. And so we're starting to see the progress, and there are other criteria we can use. The key thing is, because we haven't got formal statutory powers, we've got to persuade colleagues in different agencies to work with us. And the really good news is there is a willingness to do so, whether it's the NHS, whether it's probation, whether it's local authorities, whether it's schools, by and large, working with the police, civic society, faith communities, and the rest. And I think there really is an appetite amongst London communities, London statutory organisations, to deal with the issue that's of most pressing concern, which is the issue of violent crime.
Okay. And then let's go back to the crime plan, the London crime plan. In terms of the direction of travel of it, how would you, has it made London feel safer, and then give us some commentary of why you think it has. I mean, you touched on it in some of your opening statements, but where do you think it's made a difference, and where do you think there's more to be had?
I think one thing we can't do, and County Lines is a good example of this, is look at London by itself without looking at what's happening across England and Wales. And so the best comparator is to compare, for example, crime in London versus the rest of the country. That gives you a benchmark in relation to comparisons. So it's arguable that actually when you've seen violent crime going up across London, that actually none of the policies we're doing or none of the work the police are doing is working. But actually when you compare London with the rest of the country, you can see huge increases in most parts of the country in various crimes which we can go through, not being seen in London. You can see progress being made if you look at the numbers, and it's horrible to talk about victims as numbers, but you understand the reasons why, for the context of the conversation, we're doing so. a decrease in the number of areas of crime in London. But also we can't escape the elephant in the room, which is at a time when our city's population has been rising, police numbers have been falling. If you're running a business, the idea that you'd be, reducing numbers at a time when you need to do most work you wouldn't do. And so we've got a situation where, despite police numbers falling because of their hard work, and we talked about their professionalism, courage and bravery, we've managed to make progress. The good news is that we've managed to persuade the government at last to reverse some of their cuts in policing. We've not managed to persuade them to reverse some of their cuts on what's called the causes of crime, which is really important. Youth centres, after-school clubs, CAMs, really important as well. So, part of the equation is being tough on crime, really important, but also tough on the causes of crime as well.
Do you not think one of the aspects of, there's been many changes in policing on the back of service reductions, reorganisations and all the rest of it. Do you not think that the space for, the reaction is still there, albeit somewhat patchy across London, in terms of how the service is from the Metropolitan Police Service? Do you not think we're missing on a little bit of the violence reduction unit, the long-term problem solving of other policing aspects? Of course, senior managers will spend their time on it, but on the ground, the frontline officers that you praise, being able to give them the time to say, well, actually, I can do the reactive bit, but actually it needs a bit more longer-term problem solving here, collectively amongst me and my colleagues working with those agencies. Do you think there is the space and time for that, or do you envisage that to happen when we get the increased numbers, police numbers through?
But there's not been the space for that for some time. The intelligence gathering, by simply talking to people and listening, proactive policing, changing people's attitudes, all that's been lost because the police have been cut to the bare bone. We used to have, if you remember, in each ward in London, one sergeant, 2 police officers and 3 community support officers. We didn't reduce crime by magic. It was by investing in proactive policing. So these safe-enabled teams would listen to young people and find out what the issues were, would listen to shopkeepers, find out what the issues were, would listen to those who work in the town centre, particularly around the evenings and the Fridays and Saturdays, to know what the issues were, and then respond intelligently in advance of a small problem becoming a big problem. They've been cut away over a period of time, and so now, because there are so few, often they're responding or reacting, as you said, to incidents of crime. They're not being nipped in the bud, and that's one of the reasons why we can be optimistic, because we're now seeing more police officers. Hopefully, there'll be more proactive police, and the police by consent. And so rather than having 30,000, 31,000 people policing our city, if we had 10 million people helping the police by being their eyes and ears, by giving the information, it'd be a big difference. And if you listen to the country's leading counter-terror expert, he will say that you can't disaggregate policing. So the role of the local Bobby and the beat, inverted commas, listening to somebody, getting intelligence, is really important to deal with issues, not just with the low-level crime, but issues as important as terrorism as well, which can lead to, lives being lost. So it's really, it's a whole policing plan we need, but we need the resources to support our police.
Now, once you get those resources in extra police officer numbers, would you envisage there's lots of priorities across the Met. Of course, some of this is operational, but in that conversation that you have with senior officers, would you envisage giving more police officers towards the Violent Reduction Task Force, as in what I think the inspector was inferring? Would you expect that at least some of those officers may be allocated to activities to reducing violence per se?
I think in the short term, our priority must be violent crime. And so in the short term, our focus has got to be any additional resources we have to do with violent crime. You'll know, for example, because we've discussed this, concern about what we're seeing in the area of robbery. Well, if you did a Venn diagram, there's a link between robbery, violent crime we're concerned about, and there's an overlap. And so if we can deal with violent crime, you're solving a number of other issues as well. Drug stealing as well is linked with the violent crime. So that's got to be, in the short term, our focus. Any additional resources, I'm sure if the Commissioner will say, should be directed towards violent crime. But I think underneath your question is the issue of, proactive policing, and I think when we've got sufficient resources, we'd all want that to happen.
Okay. I've got a couple of more questions, just two more very quick questions to go through. Of course, you know, everyone focusing on violent crime, and one of the issues was the consequences probably of the cuts process, release under investigation, the bail issues. Now, in terms of that, the Met's doing, we've heard, this committee's heard what the Met's doing, I've asked you questions at Mayor's Question Time, and the government is about to consult. I think this is where policy meets operational. I'm fairly hawkish about this, and I think politicians decide this, not just leave it to senior police officers. Would you have said that the consequences of releasing that has actually not as hindered some of our pursuit of tackling these people who are violent? I'm particularly thinking of those that have been released while under investigation where there's been a violent aspect to their crime. And you know, in that sense, will you be making representations to government consultation as well, or will the Met be? You may not be in a position to tell us about the Met, but if you could come back to us, I'd be grateful, because I have a view on it, and I think other members of this committee across parties share my view, that it might have been a well-intended policy, but it just sends the wrong message. And with screening out crimes, it may help police officers do it, but I don't think it protects the public, and I don't think it pursues our aim of driving down violent crime or sending strong messages about it.
I think the changes made by the government in relation to bail and released under investigation have been counterproductive. I think they've led to people who should be released under stringent bail conditions not being done so. That leads to more concerns around safety and violence on our streets. But B, you imagine if you're a victim of crime or somebody coming forward to give evidence, how do you feel and what's your confidence in the process when you see that person ostensibly getting away with it? I've already made representations to the Home Secretary and the government. The Commissioner has as well. We'll be responding formally to the consultation. I think the government realised they made a mistake. I'm not suggesting necessarily the pendulum goes back completely the way it was before, but they've got it wrong. And I think, to be fair, we should have the good grace to give credit the fact that they are looking at a mistake made from them and consulting on a change. We criticise politicians for doing U-turns. I think they deserve credit for looking at the evidence on the ground, accepting it's not working, consulting on what should be done, and I'll be responding formally in due course.
Of course, that came alight from a BBC investigation, so we should give credit for those who also do other scrutiny, actually exposing politicians to that, to saying something is terribly wrong here. Lastly, just on performance, Chair, on this, another aspect of violent crime, performance which is not, you know, there are a lot of good people in the Metropolitan Police Service working hard to protect us, but the postcode lottery around, there's questions later on about the violent reduction unit, but the issue of domestic violence, we've got some really good performance going on in some of the new commands, but actually some of the other commands where there is no outcome, or where those measures, do you see further initiatives of driving that type of violence down within our communities? I know it's a wider society issue, but in terms of that, it shouldn't be right that if you're a victim, that you take a chance of what sort of response you get, not just in policing, but other support services. What's your thinking about that performance, and how do we drive up performance inside the Met? I'm concerned about outcomes. I don't see walking away from these situations where increasingly it can lead to murder, and there's no outcome in it. When I know it's a complex crime, when you know there is a victim, and you know there is a perpetuator of this crime, and no outcome is not acceptable.
I agree. Can I just make this point? Look, just like not all teachers are perfect, not all politicians are perfect, not all police are perfect. You got to distinguish between systems failures and the individual failing. The Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner are seized with the fact they want to improve performance across the Met Police Service and make sure lessons are learned, but also where things aren't working well for the centre to go in and sort that out. The basic command unit has led to huge improvements in some parts of London, not necessarily in other parts of London, but you and I both know that actually it takes a number of times before somebody's a victim of domestic abuse and domestic violence before they go to, forget a police officer, the GP. And the idea that once somebody's got the courage to do so, they're not given the assistance they deserve is obviously not good enough. What we're doing is not just making sure that the police performance is as good as it can be, but also there's multi-agency approach, make sure GPs are trained. We've separately funded training for GPs and health workers around violent crime, but that includes domestic abuse, by the way, domestic violence. I want to reassure you, when we talk about violent crime, we include domestic violence and domestic abuse as well, and the VRU's work includes around this series as well, because you're absolutely right, it's as heinous and serious as the stuff we see happening on the streets with the stabbings, and it's really important we get equipped with that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We are limited for time, so I've got 3 other members who want to come in on this session. Assembly Member O'Connell, Assembly Member Hall, and then Assembly Member Arbour, and then we really got to move on.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr Mayor. Yes, I know we're limited for time, but the time that we have with you on this subject I think is worth using. And it is the last time I think you will be in front of this committee during this 4-year term. And I think it's worth reflecting on that point. And I think probably the picture that Londoners will recognise, may not recognise it so rosy as the last exchange that we've just heard. Has your police and crime plan made London a safer city over these 4 years? Do you feel Londoners feel safer now than they did 4 years ago?
Depends which Londoner you speak to. So if you're a Londoner who is suffering deprivation, social inequality and poverty, I suspect you don't feel safer now than since probably 2011. Each year since 2012, serious youth violence has been going up.
Nationally. Your 4 years. We're scrutinising you, Mr Mayor. We're looking at your plan, your 4-year plan. Over 4 years, do you think London's become a safer city over your 4 years?
As I said, it depends which Londoner you speak to. So somebody who suffers deprivation, social inequality and poverty probably doesn't feel very safe. Other Londoners may feel safe, but it also depends what sort of crime that you're potentially the victim to.
All right.
It also depends if you've moved into London. So if you've moved into London from another part of the country, you definitely feel safer than you were there, because we know from the crime figures that other parts of the country have bigger increases in crime than London.
All right, okay. I'll pursue a further point. I mean, at the moment, I remember 2008, I've been around long enough, when homicide was very high. We've now got to that state of figures of 2008, 12-year high. Under your last 4 years, TNOs, total notifiable offences, have gone up. Violence against the person has gone up. So I don't really recognise a narrative that London is safer under your mayoralty. But can I turn, if I may, to, and we've agreed that violent crime is the #1 issue, can I turn to the local volume crime priorities that you've worked with boroughs about? So these are what I fondly call what were enabled crimes. Under your arrangements, you scrapped away the MOPAC 7, and we won't waste time talking about the history of that, and introduced a different framework that I fondly call perhaps a MOPAC 8 now. But under those local enabled crimes, they too have gone up. The volume crimes have gone up. Surely that also is an issue. You touched upon burglary, robbery. They've all gone up, Mr Mayor, in these 4 years.
Well,
how would you like to comment on that?
Let me just unpack what you said. You mentioned 2008, when homicides were very high.
They were.
You'll recall in 2008, and I remember this because I was a member of the government that did so, we invested a huge amount from central government to assist places like London to deal with the issue of the increase in homicides and violent crime. We've not seen that in the last 4 years during my mayoralty, and one of the reasons why you saw the reduction from 2008 onwards up until 2012 was the huge investment from central government. You'll be aware in those days 80% plus of money came from central government. That's now down to 70%. So you can't disaggregate the link between investing in policing and cutting in policing and the causes as well. So there is a direct link in relation to those, and you asked me to comment, and my comment is cuts have consequences both in terms of enforcement, but also in terms of the pipeline that leads to people getting involved in crime. In relation to the police and crime plan and the local priorities, in those parts of London where the local community with the police have chosen specific local priorities, you'll be aware there are pan-London priorities and there are local priorities. And those parts of London where a particular type of crime is a local priority, we've seen either a reduction in those areas of crime or the increase, not a start, as in other parts of London. So local priorities does have an impact in relation to crime in those areas. What we wanted to do is, rather than City Hall imposing 7 criteria, which can lead to perverse consequences, but local communities as well been involved in some of the priorities of the police.
We're here to reflect on 4 years' performance under your morality in fairness. So we've noted that homicide is high. I've already noted enabled crimes are going up, TNOs are going up. This isn't a particularly good record just under these 4 years, is it, Mr Mayor?
Well, let me deal with, you mentioned commentary, so victims of knife crime with injury decreasing, under 25 knife crime with injury going down, detection rates for homicides going up, gun crime offences going down, gun discharges going down, moped-enabled crime going down, domestic abuse, the most severe offences going down, number of complaints against the police since body-worn videos which are investigated going down.
Yeah, and thank you. We can exchange figures, but I will stop it there. We're going to have a debate around the VRU later, so I'll park that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you much. Mr Mayor, the safety of Londoners is the most important job of the Mayor. You said at the beginning, completely agree with you. So if we just look at your 4 years, it's been an absolute disaster in that respect. If you look, and I'll give proper figures here, robbery is up 73%, homicide is up 34%, residential burglary is up 38%, knife crime is up 39%. If you think it's the most important thing, then you must admit you've been a complete failure.
Chair, let me deal with the question and the assertion made by the Assembly member. Firstly, over the last 4 years, I've been unsuccessful in persuading the government to reverse the cuts made to our city until the last few months. And finally, my third Prime Minister, we've had some movement from this government. So I accept that I failed to persuade a Conservative government to reverse the cuts they've made. But in relation to numbers, which is the challenge raised by the Assembly member, let's deal with numbers. And I should be given time to answer the question in relation to numbers. In relation to victims of knife crime with injury, there are 446 fewer victims, a 10.2%.
Mr Mayor, we don't want to go.
Sorry,
We've all got the thing. No, these are figures.
Sorry, let him just finish the answer.
But he's going to use up. He's only giving us 1 hour, Chairman, 1 hour to answer to all of the issues that he should be answering to.
You'll get a question. Mr Mayor, carry on.
Chair, I'm not really sure what the criticism is. A question is asked with figures.
The failure is the criticism.
The question is asked in relation to me, in relation to figures put to me by the Assembly member, and I respond giving figures, and I'm criticised for responding with figures. And I think, Chair, it's for you to decide how you want this meeting to be conducted. Either it's a committee where members ask me questions and I answer, or it's an opportunity to make parts political points. I can do either.
And all you do, Mr Mayor, because we've seen it before, is filibuster. You blame the
Just get your
government for
questions
everything.
in.
You have an £18 billion budget. You could have put money into any of these areas earlier, but you spend all your time criticising others. My simple point, and I'll leave it there, is the fact that you know that crime has been really bad for the last 4 years. You have not diverted your considerable budget towards it. All you are happy to do is to blame others. I'll leave it at that, Chairman.
Chair, I'm sorry, Chair. I'm not sure how you want to conduct this meeting, because if this meeting is for members to make points, I don't really need to be here. If the point of this committee is for members to ask the Mayor questions for me to answer them, then there is a purpose for me to be here. And Chair, I think you've got to decide how you're going to conduct this meeting. And I can make points as well, or I can answer questions asked by members of the Assembly.
We are here to question you, for you to answer our questions. And sometimes members do actually...
The question then is, why didn't you divert money into the police earlier?
Chair, let me ask that. Well, if that's a question, I can answer that.
Hold on. Sorry. We are short of time. Can you stick to questions? Be very precise. Assemblymember Barber.
How do you account, Mr Mayor, for the fact that public satisfaction with policing in London across every single measure is at its lowest during the period of your mayoralty? How do you account for that?
Direct link between trust and confidence in the police and the lack of police officers there are in London. And so it's hardly surprising when you see, for example, last year we have fewer than 30,000 police officers, the fewest since any year since 2003, at a time when our population has grown by 1.5 million. Members of the public, not surprisingly, don't see police officers as much as they used to. One of the reasons why I've invested record sums in the police, more than £230 million since I became mayor, is because I recognise the importance of the police, not just simply to fight crime, but to make Londoners feel safer as well. And I predict an increase in trust and confidence as we see some of the investment from City Hall towards policing, aided by finally some of the cuts made by the government being reversed.
Don't you think that's a bit simplistic? Whenever you're asked about policing, or indeed pretty much any other failure of your policies right across the board, you always say it's loss of funding, and you say that you're working terribly hard to replace that funding. I've just listened to you talking about the 55 million new money. Well, of course, it isn't new money. The bulk of that that you have announced today is a re-announcement. The vast bulk of that comes from the increase in the preset, which I don't know how many times you've announced over the past 3 months. Don't you think that you're actually misleading Londoners by saying that you're ploughing more and more money back into policing, and that in itself is somehow or another going to stop crime?
Well, Chair, I think the member may have misspoke just now, because I'm sure he wasn't alleging that the announcement today is anything but new. He will be aware, because he listens during Mayor's question time and plenaries, that my announcement up until today in relation to preset has been £45 million towards tackling violent crime. The announcement today is a new announcement that wasn't there before, that will be seen in the next session of the hearing, the plenary, to do with the budget. By the way, this new announcement today is subject to the Assembly voting for it. In the past, the Tories have voted against my increased investment in the police. So my new announcement today is £55.5 million of new money towards tackling violent crime, which takes the total amount this year, for the first time, not announced before, more than £100 million towards tackling violent crime. Some of that will go towards the Met Police Service, some of that towards the Violence Reduction Unit, some of that towards the Young Londoners Fund. So the new figure today for Young Londoners Fund is now £70 million. The previous figure was £45 million. I'm sure the member would wish to reflect in his assertion that this is a re-announcement.
Well, let's have this in words of one syllable. The £55 million you have announced today does not include any money from the precept increase which you've already announced.
No, it's new money.
It's entirely new. So I wonder again, if you would explain in very simple English. No. I mean, Londoners are entitled to know where this money is coming from.
He has answered your question. You may not like his answers. Sorry, with your great experience, I hate to interrupt you. Right. He has answered the question. You may not be happy with his answer. He's been very clear. It's new money. And with that, I really got to move on to the final question this session. The final question. Sorry, Sean. Assembly Member Page on facial recognition, and then we move on.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I questioned the Commissioner last week about live facial recognition, the rollout in London, and the fact she had said only last summer it was miles away, the technology. 7 months later, it's being rolled out in London. Do you believe the technology and the regulations surrounding live facial recognition technology have come on miles in the last 7 months? And are you supportive of this rollout of this technology in London without any national framework?
What the Commissioner said, to be fair to her, is that what she's doing is using facial recognition with human beings being there as well to check it. So what she's not doing, what the Met Police Service aren't doing, is relying just on technology. And so what they're doing is, just like in the past and still now, the police often use spotters in relation to spotting people who may be wanted. These are human beings who are fallible, as is facial recognition. What she's saying is that there will be facial recognition aided and abetted by human beings, police officers, spotters sometimes, other times other police officers, who will check the accuracy of the facial recognition. What none of us think we're ready to do is to go to a situation where facial recognition is used by itself, because you'll be aware of the problems there have been in the past with the pilots used, not just in London, but around the country as well.
But are you comfortable, as the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, for this new technology to be rolled out in London without any national framework?
What I've made sure is that we have an independent ethics panel, independent from me as well as the MPS. They come up with a recommendation, and the reassurance I've sought is that the Met Police Service have addressed the concerns raised by the independent ethics panel, but also they've been completely transparent with Londoners. So the MPS, unlike in the past that I can think of, have on their website, and I know you've probably been to the website, other Londoners watching should go to the MPS website, look at the legal mandate they're using to justify live facial recognition, but also look at the various procedures in place to give the reassurance I think Londoners rightly want.
Okay, so you're confident the processes are in place?
Well, I mean, the ethics panel's concerns have been addressed. The assurances they've sought have been addressed by the MPS. The legal mandate is published, but there's going to be a court case, and so let's wait and see what the judges decide to do in relation to the challenge to the MPS. And it is really important. By the way, the reason why we've got court cases, the reason why this is challenged in the courts is because of the failure of the government to keep abreast in relation to guidance, regulations, governance for technology that's moving so fast.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Sean, a very quick minute.
Yes, I don't want to ask about facial recognition. I've asked the Met Police for a timeline of the decision-making process, which concerns me, but hopefully they'll provide that separately. I did want to ask about confidence and body-worn video. You've said on a number of occasions that body-worn video was a game-changer in relation to particularly the increase in stop and search. We heard from the Commissioner last week that the community monitoring groups, community reference groups, viewing of body-worn video hasn't been going on for several months.
It's about performance, this section.
Yeah, it's about confidence.
Well, we got questions later.
The Mayor often comments that body-worn video is a game changer in terms of confidence. It's a very quick question.
Right, can you just put your question and you answer and we move on?
And so, going back, the Commissioner has said this has not been going for several months. We understand it to be a question of data protection and the lack of resources to anonymise the videos. I would like to know that you're going to do something to try and speed up the process of getting body-worn video spot checks done again by the community, because it worries me that this essential aspect of that technology isn't being monitored.
I would just say there's no unwillingness on the part of the MPS. It simply is to clarify the issue of GDPR.
Yes, exactly.
And so they're going as fast as they can. I think it's important for the community monitoring groups to look at this stuff, body-worn videos. I would just make this point that since we've introduced body-worn videos, Chair, there's been a 39% reduction in complaints made against frontline officers, which I think is a welcome development. Bear in mind, there's been an increase in stop and search.
Okay, and very finally, to clarify...
Fine, that's it, thank you.
Oh my God.
I think most people do accept that body-worn video cameras are a game changer. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are now moving to a section to be led by Assemblymember Pigeon, keeping children and young people safe.
All right, yes, okay, thank you very much indeed. Mr. Mayor, has your police and crime plan improved the safety of children and young people in London, and what areas do you think you perhaps could do better?
I don't think the improvements have been anywhere near what we need to do. So you will be aware, because we discussed this, the HMI's report in 2016 raised serious issues about safeguarding, and the progress I'd have liked to have seen up until now we've not seen. You'll be aware that one of the things the Deputy Mayor did was get together multi-agencies to do regular meetings and reviews in relation to progress. HMI's come back and they've recognised as well that the progress hasn't been as far as we'd like to have gone. The Commissioner and the Deputy are making sure that more and more officers are trained up on this issue. There's often not the training that you need mainstream officers to have in this area. That's been increased rapidly. I've got the numbers here, which I can find in a moment. But I think we can do better. We need to do better, and I think what we'll see is an acceleration of the progress like this rather than like this, which is what we've been, which is not good enough.
Thank you for that. I mean, the last review, which was published last year from HMI, there, really wasn't a good read either. And, it talks about effective practice remains weak, opportunities to act quickly and decisively to protect children and prevent offending is still being missed, lack of supervision, high workload of investigators, allowing drift and delay, and it's not in the best interest of victims and means children may be left at risk. So what extra are you doing to try to make sure that we turn this area around and make sure children are safe in the capital?
We established a separate children and young people service in 2018-19, and one of the things they're doing is looking at this whole issue. There's also now serious youth violence caseworkers to help in this issue as well. And you will know that a victim today may carry on being a victim, but also when they have children, they may be victims as well. So it's really important to invest in this. You'll be aware of the work we've done in relation to investing in the Child House, the first of its kind in the country, multi-agency work. The good news in relation to the Child House is Since it was formally opened, there have been 214 young people gone through the child house, and you know the trauma of giving a statement to the police first, then medically examined, then court hearing. Now we can do a multi-agency approach to avoid that trauma being repeated through the process. That leads to that person hopefully not being a victim again, but also justice being done with the right person being properly prosecuted and getting the commensurate sentence when found guilty. The figures for training is getting better. So there are thousands of police officers who have now been trained in relation to the issue of the skill set required, which is important. We're also making sure that HMI are invited back regularly to give constructive feedback as well as how well we're doing. You'll also be aware of the overlap with the work of the VRU in this area as well. One of the things that I did last year was, notwithstanding the £44 million investment in the violence against women and girls area, because I saw the backlog and the issues which you've highlighted before, I announced an additional £15 million to deal with backlog. For example, there were people who were waiting 6 months who were victims of rape before they could see somebody at one of the centres we were supporting, which can't be good. The final part, before I ask the next question, is also we've got to deal with the issue of attrition, because if a case takes 2 years from a report being made to reach court, you can't be surprised where that person doesn't want to proceed with the trial 2 years down the road.
Absolutely. And HMI were particularly concerned about how the Met responds to indecent images of children and online child sexual exploitation cases and management of sex offenders. And they reviewed, this is the latest review, 34 online cases and found 29 were inadequate or required improvement. So what have you done as a result of this latest report, particularly around this area of online child sexual exploitation, managing sex offenders?
One of the things that the group I refer to with multi-agency approach, which has dedicated senior leads and governance structures in place, is to look at this area that you just mentioned. By the way, the figures of officers who have been trained is 6,500 officers have already been trained in relation to the child protection cases. You'll have seen the announcement today from the government in relation to asking Ofcom to do far more around small p policing of online stuff. That'll help. You'll be with the government's consultation in this area, which we responded to as well. I'm not going to pretend that London by itself can grapple with these issues. We need central government involvement, and I welcome the announcement today as far as I've seen the details.
Okay, well, we look forward to seeing the next HMI report and hope that there has been some improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the next section, Mr. Mayor, tackling violence against women and girls. Before I bring in Assembly Member Sean Berry to ask you a couple of some questions, I've been asked by the committee to inform you that on the 1st of November last year, I wrote to both you and to your Deputy Mayor about a report about a recommendation of sexual offences and rape. To date, we haven't yet received a response. There may be reasons, but we do find it a bit disconcerting that somewhat November, December, January, we haven't had a response. So if you could look into this matter, we'd be very grateful.
Can I apologise for that? I'll look at that straight away after the committee. Yeah.
There may be reasons, but it's important we put our concerns on record. Thank you.
I indicated earlier on in an attempt to make the meeting run more efficiently, because Assemblymember Duval and Assemblymember Pigeon have both asked questions relating to domestic violence and violence against women and girls. I might forego these questions in order to help the meeting run more quickly. We can move on to police numbers.
Right, you sure?
That's what I was indicating earlier.
Okay, that helps.
That's okay, thank you.
Right. In which case, I'm just moving back, and we can always write to the Mayor later anyway.
Exactly.
Coming back to what was originally item number 2 on the agenda, 2 or 3 questions from me, and I'll be as disciplined as I can be, which is about standing together with extremism, hatred and intolerance. Can I just ask you, very generally, Mr. Mayor, do you feel you've done all you can within your current powers and resources to tackle extremism in London?
We can always do more. We can always do better. But we're making progress. So I'll give you some examples of some of the progress we're making. So the Shared Endeavour fund, which we announced of £1 million to help communities, the grants programme will make a difference. It only came on stream a few months ago because we had to do the research first. The most extensive research ever undertaken in London around extremism, not just the so-called Islamist extremism, but also the extreme far right as well. So we're trying to stop a pipeline of people becoming extremists. That means strengthening communities against extremism, encouraging Londoners to stand up to hate and intolerance, safeguarding particularly vulnerable Londoners from radicalisation, and stopping the spread of extremist ideologies. At the other end of the spectrum, because of the brilliance of our police and security services, they've thwarted, I think, 25 terrorist attacks since March 2017. 16 of them were so-called Islamist extremists. 8 were far-right extremists. And so, we've made progress, but I've just got to just tell the committee that, according to the counter-terror experts, we're facing a shift, not a spike, a shift in attempts by terrorists to, divide communities and destroy our way of life. And we've got to be resolute and, make sure that we are as prepared as we can be.
Right. So the question that everyone out there wants to, wants answer to: how confident are you, Mr. Mayor, in the continuing preparedness of the Metropolitan Police to respond to terrorist incidents?
I think the thing that gives me confidence is that after every thwarted attempt, or after every attempt where people are injured or lose their lives, the police and others review and reflect how things could have been done better. I'll give you just one example. I was in Streatham this weekend, and 6 days after the terror attack 2 Sundays ago, one of the concerns raised was the issue of the hot zone. And this is a decision taken whereby others can't come into the hot zone until we know it's no longer a danger. And so you'll have seen the criticism around the 30 minutes before the ambulance service were allowed to deal with those who were injured. They were there within 4 minutes, but because of the hot zone, the decision was taken not to jeopardise the safety of others by allowing them in. The Commissioner herself has said that actually she's looking into whether that can be changed to allow people who are medical experts to get to people injured far swifter. By the way, if that device on the individual had been a genuine improvised explosive device, you can understand why there's a reluctance to allow people inside the hot zone. So I'm really confident, because what you see is not just the police and other first responders, the security services, but everyone looking to see how they can learn and improve, to make sure we're as safe as we can be.
I should say the Commissioner was before us last week, and I put this question to her about the police hot zoning, warm zones, cold zones, and she did say, in the Times reported her response to my question, she did say that she would review the situation, because there's some concerns amongst police doctors as well. So moving on, Mr. Mayor, so we have 2 terrorist incidents now in the last couple of months committed by people released on license from prison. Nazir Afzal, ex-Chief Crown Prosecutor, and people like Ian Acheson, prison governor, ex-prison governor, who's written quite a lot on this issue, have said that the debate should be about more than just sentencing, and it has focused on whether sentences should be increased for such people. It should be also about effective de-radicalization and effective probation support. Because, as I think it was Mr. Afzal who said this, that simply by keeping them longer in prison without effective de-radicalization program, effective probation support, all you're delaying is them coming out and committing the crimes that we saw in London Bridge and Streatham. What have you got to say to this?
I agree with that. Look, can I just say, so put aside terrorism, unfortunately, about half of people who leave our prisons, will re-offend within a year, 50%. Why should it be any different with somebody convicted of a terror offence? And that's why what we've got to do is make sure that we, in our prisons, aren't simply using our prisons as warehouses to store people for the duration of their sentence, but using our prisons and young offenders institutes to properly rehabilitate, to reform the individual while they're in a prison. And if we don't, we can't really be surprised if when they leave prison, they re-offend. That could be terrorism, or that could be violent crime, sexual offences, and the like. And that's why, we've got to invest in our prison service, which means not just having adequate numbers of prison officers, but the right courses in prison to rehabilitate. Only a very small fraction of the 85,000 people in our prison, a very small fraction, will not be released. The vast, vast, vast majority will be. And I think where the system is failing, both prison and probation, is in doing a proper job. By the way, not helped by massive cuts in the prison service and privatising probation, which the government now accepts was a huge error.
So, just moving, Mr. Mayor, 2 questions, and I'll move to the next and final section. The CPS do the prosecuting. and clearly we don't have powers to sort of direct them. But there is concern. I mean, that hate crimes have gone up on all categories: LGBT plus hate crimes, anti-Semitic hate crimes, Islamophobic hate crimes, and prosecutions, conviction rates have fallen. How concerned are you about this, and what representations are you making, if any, or intend to make to the CPS to look at this drastic fall in convictions across all categories of hate crime?
Yeah, so the police and the CPS, although they're independent from each other, need to work closely together. There have been concerns in the past in relation to the CPS saying some of the quality of evidence they receive is not good enough to pass the CPS test. The CPS have two tests basically. One is it in the public interest to prosecute? Two, is there likely to be a successful prosecution if they bring a prosecution? They have argued in previous cases that the evidence isn't there to pass the public interest test, and you raised another question on the CPS, doing the right thing. I think what we need to do is firstly make sure that we try and nip in the bud any examples of hate crime, whether it's graffiti, whether it's online stuff, whether it's name calling on the streets, to make sure it doesn't lead to serious criminal offences being committed. That's not necessarily an enforcement issue, better education, standing together. Secondly, when there is hate crime that's properly dealt with by the police and the CPS, not just to deter others, but to make sure people are properly punished and rehabilitated as well. I think there is an issue about legislation. Is the legislation fit for purpose, bearing in mind some of the online stuff that we know about? We continue to review this, and when I meet the DPP, as I do, I put to him some of the concerns we have, and the Commission does as well.
Very final question. So in terms of, you've got prosecutions, you've got enforcement, you've got reporting, but then you also got the education side and awareness raising. How far have you got, Mr. Mayor, in commissioning a comprehensive hate crime awareness raising campaign? And we have the London is Open campaign, which you started, I think, initiated about 3 years ago. Do you think that needs to be revamped?
Always, you should always evolve policies and things you're doing. In relation to a hate awareness campaign per se, what we're doing is we're funding a number of groups that help victims of hate crime, and we've increased the funding of that, and I've been criticised for doing so. But I think it's important to realise that some people will feel more comfortable going to community groups, whether it's CST, whether it's Tell Mama, whether it's Catch, and we've got to understand that, and we've got to support them in the advocacy role they play.
Fine. Assemblymember Whittle, and then we move on to the next section.
Just a quick one, Mr. Mayor, or if I can just go back a little bit to the terror question. I take it from what you said there that you regard people in for terror offences and people in for everything else as pretty much the same. You said that they tend to re-offend, all of them. Why should they be any different? But do you not therefore agree that there is something fundamentally different in terms of motive, in terms of everything like that, about terrorists, which means that they cannot, or the priority should not be, on them being reformed? And if I can just give you one example, which happened obviously on London Bridge, in a supreme irony, the guy who was shot by, the terrorist there, was actually about to address a conference on rehabilitation, and he used the opportunity to launch a terror attack. So what I'm asking you is, do you not think that reform, and spending money on reform, to somehow rehabilitate these people is actually a waste, that in fact it should just be about keeping them in jail?
I've met people who previously used to be extreme far-right activists involved in violence, who are now helping us in relation to stopping people becoming radicalised in the far right. They have been rehabilitated and reformed, similarly with so-called Islamist extremists as well. I accept it poses particular challenges in relation to how you de-radicalise somebody who's gone that far down the path. You're right to articulate some of the concerns there are. You'll be aware that it's often possible to hoodwink, trick, cheat the system. But also I'd make this point. There are some people who argue you can't reform, rehabilitate those convicted of homicides. One of the people that jumped to the defence of members of the public to disarm this terrorist was somebody convicted of a homicide who had been clearly rehabilitated. So I think there are a small number of people who probably can't be reformed in our prisons now, but the vast majority the vast majority of 85,000 take or leave will be released at some stage. Now, if you follow the logic of your point, what you're saying, I'm sorry, I don't wish to put words in your mouth. What you could be implying is anyone convicted of a terror offence should stay in prison for life. That poses all sorts of challenges in relation to the different types of terror offences. Is distributing material the same severity as somebody who's convicted of planting a bomb? And so those are discussions that I think Parliament should be having. The key thing that is, though, is this: we reduce to virtually nil the chance of reforming anybody if we don't invest in our prisons and probation service. We need to give them the support they need to try and rehabilitate somebody convicted of the most serious offences.
Do you think, can I just have one follow-up question? Do you think that in the incident that I mentioned there, the London Bridge one, I think the decision, according to Sir Stephen House, was that the guy was given leave to come to London by Staffordshire Police, I think it was. How can it be, Mr. Mayor, I think probably technically that is Corporation of London Police, but you're the Mayor of London. How can it sort of be that he got leave also? Presumably there must have been some link-up, surely, with the police here. You must have known this guy was coming in. How come that can happen?
I think we're in danger, Chair, of agreeing. I've got questions about that incident and the one 2 Sundays ago as well, in relation to the process that take place. Just to explain, so a number of those who've been convicted and served their time and released have conditions attached to their licence. A condition could be you mustn't come to London, and if you come to London without permission, you're breaching the licence condition, you can be sent back to prison. And I've got a number of questions about those who've been released, the conditions attached to their licence, and how we make sure they're not being breached and whether they're robust enough. And some of the questions you've asked, some of the questions that I've asked over the last, since that incident in November, but also additional questions post the incident 2 Sundays ago. And those are questions that I think are reasonable for us to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. So moving to the last set of questions, a better police service for London, Assembly Member O'Connell.
Yeah, we haven't got much time, Mr. Mayor, but I'll keep it relatively brief. We've talked about confidence in the police dropping, and it is confidence as opposed to satisfaction. Confidence is how the general public feel about the police, and that's going down considerably under your mayoralty. And I think there's a connection there with the safe enabled teams. We've already talked about the importance of safe enabled teams, how they can be in the community, supporting the community. Have you delivered your commitment on safe enabled teams from the figures that you've got?
Yeah, so when I became mayor, the Safe Enabled team consisted of 1 police officer and 1 dedicated ward officer. And the promise I made to Londoners was to double the amount of dedicated ward officers from 1 to 2, even in the light of austerity from central government. And we've managed, I think in the first year, to have each ward doubling the amount of dedicated ward officers from 1 to 2 and keeping the CSO.
Okay, I mean, I've got a question out on that to chase that one through, because I think we all, particularly the constituency members, will be aware at any given time many of the wards are under strength, and at the moment that seems to be quite critical out there. I've mentioned confidence dropping down, and I think I will support the chair in urging your continued support of safe enabled boards, because I think they are intrinsic to improving confidence and engagement. They were brought in under the previous mayor. They have struggled, I think it's fair to say, in the last few years, and I would urge you, not necessarily for a long commentary about it, but to continue, if you have the opportunity, to support safe enabled boards.
Agreed.
I'll leave it at that, Chair.
That's point well made.
In the 2 or 3 minutes that you've got left, Mr. Mayor, so you can leave us at 11 o'clock, because I know you've got to go to another engagement. Just a couple of questions from me about police numbers. You told us about the 1,300 extra officers as a result of your allocation of business rates in last year's budget. And you also told us, we also know the government's allocating 1,369 additional police officers to London. But bearing in mind that you and the Commission asked for 6,000 officers, the Assembly has asked for 5,000 officers, is that number now unrealistic?
So we've got a real problem in relation to only having figures for 1 year, 2021. We think we can recruit 1,000 369 officers by September. Because we've got no certainty from the government, what happens then is what we have to do is turn the tap off and recruit no more until next April. I'm not willing to do that. So what I've done is use money raised from City Hall to continue recruiting from September up until next year to make sure we continue the pipeline of police officers coming through to London. What we need from the government is, as soon as possible, certainty for funding for years 2 and 3, and it's got to be, roughly speaking, 4,600 additional officers over the next 2 years. By the way, even with these additional 6,000 officers, we will still have fewer officers per 1,000 people than we had in 2010. In 2010, we had 4 police officers for 1,000 Londoners. Even with the additional 6,000 officers, we will be below 1,000 to 4 officers. It will be 1,000 to 3.9 officers.
So the final question from me is, you stated yesterday the government's refusal to fund the cost of extraordinary events such as the Extinction Rebellion protest and the presidential visit of President Trump may cost the Met £31 million, and I think we've been in correspondence with Kit Malthouse, the policing minister. What are the potential implications of the Met not receiving the right level of special grant funding this year?
Well, firstly, we are still being underfunded by half the amount of money we should be receiving as an international and capital city. We should get about £350 million. We receive £180 million. What's happened in the past is the government's been sensible when it comes to exceptional circumstances. What the government has said to us now is that unless a special circumstance, special grant, is more, an individual incident is more than £33 million, they will not support us. I'll give you an example. Policing President Trump's visit cost us £2.5 million, not £33 million. Policing Brexit and NATO cost us £2.1 million, not £33 million. Investigating the Grenfell Tower fire cost us £2 million, not £33 million. Policing Extinction Rebellion cost us £24 million, not £33 million. So these are just some examples of the costs we'd have to incur. And the only way we can make this money up is either to reduce the number of police officers we're recruiting, or when we're paying for officers to do overtime, officers are under-resourced, overstretched, not being able to do that. And that's why in the past, the government's been quite sensible when it comes to applications for these exceptional circumstances. I'm not asking for additional money for police in football matches, from police in concerts, from police in the ordinary protests that we see as a capital city. What I'm asking for is the fair funding that we're entitled as a national, international capital city. If they were to give us the £350 million that we're supposed to receive, and they accept we're supposed to receive, that will help, or be flexible when it comes to applications for special grant.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm finishing the first part of this meeting. Can I thank you, Mr. Mayor, for attending today and for your and for his answers to our questions. Can also thank you, Assemblymember Barry, for your help in helping me
I
with
would
the
get it
agenda.
clarified on the business rights.
Yeah. And can we note the answers given by the Mayor to the questions asked by members? Noted. Yep. Okay, I'm now going to break for a few minutes before we start part 2 of the meeting.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA, chamber, 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 sound.
So we now move to our second main item of business, which is a discussion on the London Violence Reduction Unit. And I would like to welcome our guests to the meeting, Lip Beck, Director of the Violence Reduction Unit, and Karina Wayne, Assistant Director, Violence Reduction Unit. So the number of questions that we will be asking you. I'll start off with the first question. Basically setting the scene in the background. What is the VRU's current assessment of violent crime in London? What areas are of most concern to you as director? And how do you sum up your progress to date? You were established in 2018. So if you could give us examples of what you think are some significant achievements, but also look at challenges, opportunities that you identified. So areas of your current assessment of violent crime, one. Number two, areas of most concern, some examples of achievements, and also to talk about challenges and opportunities. So just looking at the VRU from an overall perspective since 2018. I think we've had you once before at this committee, if I'm right.
Yes, that's right. It wasn't in the chamber, but I think I came about 3 months after I'd started.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity of coming along today to update you on some of the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, and obviously to try and address your kind of questions. In terms of the first question around the picture of violence in London, I think it's a fairly depressing one. 149 homicides last year was a record level. We know that there's been an increase of the number of those homicides carried out by knives, somewhere in the region of about 47%. We also know that there has been an increase in some of the reported hospital injuries arising from knife or other sharp instruments. So in terms of the statistical picture, it is not a positive one. There is, however, I think a glimmer of hope in a reduction in the recorded numbers of knife crime injuries for under 25s, which is still over 10% over the last year. So I think that's an important point, obviously, to keep an eye on and look at. I'm referring to the picture of violence very much in the context of statistics, but statistics don't in that way even really tell the real picture, because each of those 149 is a death that has a huge impact on friends and families and communities and neighbourhoods, and that's certainly something that I was very aware of from my previous role, but it's also something I've been made increasingly aware of by going out and talking to lots of different communities and lots of organisations over almost the last year since I've been in post. Areas of particular concern, well, I think in a sense, all of that is an area of concern. Our recent strategic needs assessment that was published, I think, two weeks ago, highlighted some of the trends around that violence. I've talked obviously about one, which was the increasing use of knife-enabled injury and homicide, which is an issue. It also talked about the importance of drug supply and how that is fueling the drugs market, and that is fueling violence, which I think is another area of concern. Certainly, I think something we touched on before when I was in front of the committee is around the feeling of anxieties that gives, and therefore the limitation of movement and opportunities for some young people in the capital, and therefore the feeling of safety, I think, is a really important thing for us to address as well. So I think there's a huge number of different answers actually to both to that second question, but those are some of the things I would highlight at this stage. In terms of the work of the Violence Reduction Unit over the last 11 months since I've been in post, we have established a team of very mixed experience and expertise professionals working within the unit, which I think is really important. A really good balance of people who've worked for the Metropolitan Police, who've worked for local authorities, who've got public health specialism, to really experienced youth workers who've been very much going out and doing our community engagement work. So an incredibly good base of people who I think will continue to work well as a team, and I'm very pleased that I was able to bring the Assistant Director who we appointed 5 months ago, Karina, with me today, who's had a long experience in Brent Council as well as many other organisations previous to that. So the team is one thing. Secondly, I think establishing a strategy, looking at how we were going to try and tackle this hugely complex issue of violence across London, with the complexity of structures and different organisations that are also working on it. The third would be an operating model and trying to work out how we can add value. And the things that we have assessed and we discussed before but have been reinforced, I suppose, over the last 11 months are our importance of pulling together data, pulling together intelligence, which I think is slightly differently, which is, you know, going out and speaking and listening to people, making sure that we're using that to inform our programme of investment, and we have an investment of 14.8 million over this. Well, we're in the final months of this financial year, so that's been really important to making sure that we are either addressing gaps or where we know more support is needed, or listening to what people are saying where more investment needs to go. And then finally, I suppose, developing evaluation around those programmes. And then the other thing that I would want to highlight as a key element of our work over the last 11 months has been building of partnerships. It's very clear that the Mayor doesn't have all the powers that you would perhaps assume a Mayor would have, and some of those levers around some of the issues we've talked about are quite difficult anyway, but what we have got is the ability, I think, through City Hall to be able to convene senior members of public sector organisations to come together, inform the work, and also the ability to be able to advocate for policy change where it's needed. So those are all of the things that we've managed to achieve in the first 11 months.
So in terms of your team, how many people actually work at present? In terms of your team, how many staff have you got?
So we've got a mix of part-time staff and secondments, but there's about 20 of us in the team now that are doing various bits of work. So,
That's FTE, is it?
I'm sorry?
That's FTE. 20 FTE.
No, I said it's a mix of...
what is the FTE, the full-time equivalent number of staff you have?
It's probably about 14, but
14.
that would also, or 15 actually, but that would also include people on secondment. So we have a secondee from the Metropolitan Police, we have a secondee from the Probation Service, we have somebody who has just come over from Public Health, and we are exploring the possibilities of getting other secondees into the team.
Thank you.
It's possible to send the committee some details of your staff, who
Absolutely.
does what?
Structure. Yeah.
Because unless I missed something, and if I got it wrong, I apologise. But I certainly wasn't aware of the appointment of your assistant director.
Yeah.
Only found out about her appointment this morning.
Yeah,
So it
absolutely.
would help us, because it's clearly a very important part of our work of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And the Mayor is investing a lot of money in this unit. So talking investment, I don't think you touched upon this. One of the priorities in year one was to invest in areas of high violence and in early intervention and prevention programs that have seen a proven result. Can you tell us a bit more about this particular area of investment?
I can. Sorry, just before I lose the last point that you made, I mean, it might be that members of the committee would want to meet the team as well. I'd be very happy to extend that. I think they'd be really interested in meeting with you at some point, so you can understand a little bit more about the kind of different areas of work that they're doing. So in terms of the area-based work, we spent a lot of time, and deliberately so, working closely with local authorities. I was very clear, and I think I was clear last time when I came to the committee, that we get change if we get local communities, local neighbourhoods working with local authorities, and that's not something that we can predetermine or determine even from a City Hall basis. It's got to happen at that level. So some of our funding was allocated to local authorities, 4.4 million additional in this financial year, with a continuing 4.4 in the next financial year. We used a mixed series of indicators to decide where we felt that money was most needed. So all local authorities gained, but we had a graduated scale of investment dependent on the different factors that we brought to the data tool. And so that was looking not just at crime and violence, it was also looking at public health data, and it was also adding in perceptions around feelings of violence. That's something that I think will evolve for us, but I think it was certainly our first an important attempt to see violence in a much more holistic way rather than just analysing it through crime. And through that mechanism, we determined sort of 3 different tiers of funding for those boroughs most affected, slightly less affected, and those least affected, and directed funding in that way. Each of the boroughs have produced local violence reduction plans, and and I can talk at length,
We've got some
a bit more
questions
about those.
on working with local government.
You know, that's been an important mechanism for us, I think, of assisting and aiding and adding our expertise into developing those plans. Certainly, from the strategic needs assessment that was completed a couple of weeks ago, I think it underlined for us the importance of doing not only that borough work, but that very, very sort of neighbourhood level work, which is often at a smaller level than just a ward basis. And that's certainly something that we intend to add more focus to and more investment going forward. And I think that we have, over the last 11 months, managed to strike up the kind of right relationships with many of those community groups and many of those communities across London that will enable us to do that in the most sort of supportive way.
Councillor Hall, do you want to come in at this stage? There are some more questions in this section, or
But there is, isn't there? Shall I go? So just to recap what you've said so far. So really, in the last year, you've established a team, you've established a strategy and an operating model, and you've done work on evaluating that.
And we've invested £14.8 million across London, or we've got plans to allocate all of that total. 7.8 million coming from the mayoral budget and 7 million from the Home Office.
So it is mainly plans of what you're going to do.
No, we've spent that money, so that is actually investment in programmes.
And that's being watched now by
yes,
these
and those
teams.
are the things that we obviously got to evaluate very closely. Yeah.
So, what's the VRU doing to tackle all violence among young people?
Well, the programme is addressing the things that we think are most important, and that's based on the over 100 conversations and visits that we've had over that last 11 months. It's based on the evidence that we've already got, and it's based on, and it's been reconfirmed and given us some extra insight through the strategic needs assessment. And so therefore the things that we have focused that investment on is firstly around looking at the role of youth workers, because we know that there's been 46% reduction in youth-related youth work in terms of financing over the last 5 years. But we also know from going and talking to young people that is very often the kind of key relationship for them. So we're looking at investment there of developing a training model, greater coordination, and we obviously put some money into the health youth workers within hospital settings. And we're looking to do the same around custody and diversion. So that's one element of the programme.
So you put, if I can just go back, so you put money into getting more people into that. You've assessed that there aren't as many people looking at this. Have you therefore put more money in to make a difference to that, or are you just putting money into finding out where the issues are still?
So if you looked at the pattern of our spend across the whole programme, it is both, but if you're looking specifically, so, in one instance we're saying there isn't enough support for young people who have experienced or witnessed violence, and we know they need more support, and so we put in some investment into that area. In terms of youth workers, in terms, some more support, yeah. So in terms of youth workers, which we were just talking about, we know from some of the schemes that are already in existence that approach works. That when you've got young people who've come in with an injury and they've got that moment almost of reflection, it is really important that there is somebody there qualified that can have the conversation with them and present them with a different way forward in terms of what their kind of life opportunities are, and that doesn't just stay within the hospital for that whatever it is, day 2 days a week, but then you are able to support them as when they come out. So it's it really depends on where there's an analysed gap and where there is something that is working already, and we want to add further investment to it to give it greater impact.
Okay, and you've got some way of measuring whether that's successful or not.
Yes, absolutely. All of the programmes that we have invested in have some evaluation around them. They have key performance indicators, and it's very important that we track that because there is a lot of activity going on in London, and I think one of our key challenges is to make sure that we are on top of what is working, and that's really thinking about how you evaluate those schemes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, did MOPAC never do any of this?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, MOPAC, has contracts, and each of its contracts will have KPIs. I think you very recently looked at their commissioning, did you not? Or I thought.
No, I'm trying to look with limited funds, as everybody likes to talk about, that we're not duplicating anything with the VRU or with MOPAC, because that would be a horrendous waste of money of everybody establishing strategies and teams and God knows what else if the money isn't going on the ground to actually fix the problems. I think we're concerned with how these problems are being fixed, given that I think a lot of them have already been identified by long ago, yes.
Well, if it's any help, I can give you, reassurance that we're not duplicating things that MOPAC are doing. We work very closely with them, as you would hope and expect, I think. And indeed, we work across lots of the different departments in City Hall. So we're very closely aligned with the health team, because obviously we're doing public health approach. We're working very closely with education, because exclusions is a big point. So
I think instead of assurance, we'd like evidence. That's what we're looking for. In relation to priority to tackle violence against women and girls, what have you achieved aside from having 2 meetings with women and girls networks?
Oh, well, a couple of the programmes that we're investing in are really around early identification of people who have been subjected to domestic abuse. So I can give you some examples of programmes that we are supporting, and that's in full knowledge of our MOPAC colleagues. The first is around something called IRIS, which is training and supporting GPs to be able to spot the signs of somebody who's coming in as a patient but isn't coming in as a patient to reveal that they are being abused. And we've seen some of that work across London already taking place, and seen an 8% increase in the number of referrals, and we're seeing a 95% increase in the satisfaction of those patients getting the support they then need. And we know from evidence in the parliamentary reports, we know from evidence that we've got from this building, we also know from evidence that many other local authorities have done, that domestic abuse, somebody who's experienced domestic abuse is much more likely to become a victim of further violence. So getting to that source, doing that prevention work is really important, and that's an established programme. Yeah.
We were talking about this long before the VRU, I think.
Great.
Then MOPAC would have, I assume, dealt with that. So this case specifically, IRIS as an example, how much money are you putting into that?
So putting in 1 million over 2 years. That means that we're able to extend the service to 7 boroughs. And as I perhaps referred to, there are 2 key indicators around that. One is an increase in referrals, and the second is an increase in the satisfaction of patients' experience. From some of the boroughs that programme is already operating in, we know that it has been successful. So it seems, going back to your original question, it seems that is an area which is proven to have had good positive results. It's an area which we know is of great concern and that can help us tackle the cycle of violence, and therefore that's why we're investing money in that particular programme.
Okay, and it's something completely new. Nobody's ever done this before.
No, sorry. What I just said was that the programme, we had evidence that the programme worked because it's already operating in some of the boroughs, and that's where we get the statistic of there's been an 8% increase in referrals from where that programme has been operating, and where we've seen a 95% increase in satisfaction from patients being treated. We therefore see that as a good programme, that's been evaluated well, it's got the relevant I think it's got the evidence you would want to be seeing of an effective programme, and so we're using some of our resource, given the importance of that issue, to roll that out further across London.
Why do you think the VRU is better placed to put money in it than MOPAC, as an example?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think the VRU is better placed to put money into it than MOPAC?
Well, I think the important thing, surely, is that the money's going into the programme, and that you're using that as a way to tackle violence. I'm not quite sure on the premise of the question.
No, I disagree. Actually, I think if money is being put into things, the less money that is spent on administration and various different groups, the better, because we want more money going in to where it's needed. How does this VRU differ from the one in Glasgow?
Well, we had a great trip to Glasgow, and we learned a lot from that. That was after I think I came to the committee beforehand. In terms of its ethos and its approach, not hugely different. It believes in a public health approach. It believes in prevention rather than just relying or focusing on enforcement. It believes very strongly that communities and young people are at the heart of solutions, and it's looking in terms of its investment to put into programmes that are quite similar to the work that we've supported here. I think that so at that level, not greatly. I think what perhaps is different, though, is obviously the context in which they're working and the context in which we're working. And I think if you really sort of tackle and understand a public health approach, it's got to be as much about the kind of context in which that violence is occurring as much as supporting individuals.
Well,
so to that extent, the kind of...
I think with respect, we all understand that. I had been told
well,
that the Glasgow model had changed considerably and was now just concentrating on early years. I take it that's not correct.
I don't know that they... I don't know that... Sorry, Prina, did you want...
They've still got the Violent Crime Task Force related to it, but they've slightly changed over the 10 years in terms of the focus.
I've been told they've changed quite dramatically. Only one of their members is on your board, aren't they?
No, no longer. No. Do you mean Niven Rennie? Niven Rennie.
Okay, it's in our notes that I think somebody from the Glasgow one is on your board.
No,
so
not anymore.
Perhaps we could have a refreshed account of who's on the board. I'll leave it there for now.
You. Okay. So moving to the second section, some questions already been asked, but if I can bring you in now, Senator Pigeon, and then I think Senator Shanberry as well.
I did just want to pick up on the GP example you gave, the IRIS thing. So it was in 10 boroughs. You've rolled it out to an additional 7. Why not do the whole of London if it's so successful?
Yeah, I think that's a very good challenge and something we'll certainly be looking at in the next year.
Because it sounds like it's been proven and piloted, so why not have this for every part?
It's really impressive. Yeah, I agree.
That's something you're going to look at. Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. Clearly we're interested in understanding how the VRU performs and how effective it is, and that's picking up in some ways some of the questions from Assemblymember Hall. But what clear mechanisms has the Mayor put in place to evaluate your performance and your effectiveness, and what KPIs have been developed?
Okay, so as I explained a bit earlier on, we've got sort of two main sources of funding. One is from the Home Office, and I'll talk about the evaluation mechanism in relation to that first. And then the second is the mayoral budget, and I'll come on to that. I think the Home Office grant came with 7 million last year, and I'm really pleased that indications have been that we're getting 7 million in the next financial year. The first one was to spend the money. That was the first criteria that we had to, having been told we had the money in July 2018, we had to spend it by March I'm losing a year here, aren't I? In 2019 rather, in July, we had to spend it by the end of March this year. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to make sure that we underwent a strategic needs assessment of the picture of violence across London. That was relatively straightforward for us because we'd already commissioned that piece of work, and then to make sure that we had a partnership response to that assessment, which we are doing. Then there were 3 very specific statistics which actually the Chair, in response to the Chair I mentioned earlier on, which is one, reduction in homicides, the second was reduction in hospital injuries or recorded hospital data for injuries under 25-year-olds, and then the other was recorded knife crime injuries under 25. So on that basis of those 3, obviously there's one that is prompting a positive picture. I think it's worth saying that the Home Office subsequently, of course, then set up 17 other VRUs across England and Wales. So we were in a slightly different position, having already been established and having already developed our own strategy. So that was reassuring in a way, because one would hope, therefore, that there's a kind of continued funding and a bit of political consensus around it. But in terms of evaluation, I think that they would definitely recognise, and have said as much, that those are fairly crude indicators of how you measure success. And so we are one of the test sites, along with a couple of other of the 18 VRUs, to develop a slightly more sophisticated evaluation as we go forward. So I think that's really positive for us. In terms of our more general work and how that then relates to, I suppose, the test for the other element of the budget, if I could put it like that, There are KPIs attached to all of the programmes that we've invested in. I gave one example there around IRIS, but I mean, if we unpicked all of the different elements that we've spent that 7.8 million on, you would see a similar set of KPIs looking at, I would hope, the most intelligent questions to ask. But we're very keen to talk and have that kind of conversation with the providers as well, so that we're not doing it kind of, you know, arm's length from what they're trying to achieve, and that's certainly something we've been doing. In terms of the more general evaluation piece and the work of the unit, we've been working with public health colleagues and particularly the NHS, who are setting up a kind of data academy on all this stats to see if there's a way, if there's a better, a more, again, sophisticated way we can reflect both impact and kind of impression and feelings of safety. So that's evolving. So that would be our sort of suite of evaluation measures.
That's very interesting. Are these publicly available, the ones that you're currently using?
I don't know whether they could be. I'd need to take advice. I mean, I'm very happy to share some of them.
I think we would
People
be
got particular
helpful for
interest.
us
If I
to,
can, I
to,
don't see.
that would be would be very helpful. And last year you told us that you would be interested to get some of the community to help develop your thinking around KPIs. That sounds a bit like you're talking about this new sophisticated way of measuring and talking to providers. So how are you going to develop that to make sure you have the right ways for us to measure your success and you to measure your success in tackling
I think
these
it is
issues?
a partnership approach, and so therefore it needs to be, it's, you know, there's obviously an expectation on the unit, which is absolutely right, but there is also something about that broader piece. So, I mean, just taking, I mean there's a couple of ways of demonstrating that, I suppose. On specific programmes, it is making sure that we are having a more joined up conversation with the different organisations involved, and by that I was just talking about the funding, some of the extra funding we've given to youth workers in hospitals. We're also convening a group with all of the different kind of partners who are engaged in youth work, so see if we're measuring the right thing. I mean, it struck me when I went up to the North Middlesex Hospital, where we put in some investment, and the Oasis youth workers were there and were talking to us, you know, that they were saying it would be, sometimes it feels too much like how many numbers of young people you treat rather than the impact of that treatment on those young people and what it does for their life chances. And they were very interested in extending that kind of conversation with other partners, and we're facilitating that. So, you know, Red Thread, Oasis, some of the other providers that you will know well. So that's the way we want to do that. That's quite organisational, I appreciate, and we start by talking about communities. The other element of work that we funded and started to again work closely with the communities, with the London Community Fund, is the 39 organisations across London, which are very grassroots, which we're only giving no more than 50,000 to in each individual case, not always that amount of money, but who are doing that valuable community neighbourhood work. And we held a meeting for those the other day at the South Bank as a kind of get together, so that we could actually start that. How do you really shape up what we're trying to assess your success beyond here's some money, and come back with a suite of statistics? So that's kind of evolving and a bit dependent on which programme you're talking about, but it certainly still is absolutely at the essence of what the Violence Reduction Unit's trying to do.
It would be interesting to see how that develops
sure.
over the coming months and year. Now, you mentioned the strategic needs assessment, which was a condition from the Home Office, but you're right, you'd already started it. It was commissioned in October 2018. It was commissioned, and then it was due to come out a lot earlier, but the reports only came out in January 2020. I think that was 6 months later than originally planned. What caused that delay? What was the issue?
I think it just took them a bit longer than they'd anticipated. With two commissioned organisations for us. One was the Social Care in Excellence, which is attached to the University of Bedfordshire, and the other one was the Behavioural Insights team. And it was the first time that all of the statutory reviews over the last few years had been pulled together, and so there was quite a lot of profound questions on, you know, how they assembled that information. And obviously, a strategic needs assessment of violence across London is again quite a, you know, quite an undertaking. I mean, if we'd been waiting just for that evidence to shape up our work, then I think that would have been a problem. We'd done an awful lot of other stuff in terms of, you know, working with organisations, bringing together the data tool, getting a project with the Information Commission's office off the ground as well. So it's not we've been kind of twiddling our thumbs waiting for it, but I appreciate it did take longer than we had originally anticipated. But both of them are very useful documents now.
Yes. Lovely, thank you very much.
Sure.
Susan's next.
Sorry, please.
That's all right.
I thought you already, go on.
Yeah. In what ways do you feel the VRU has enhanced City Hall's understanding of violence in London?
I think it's enhanced it through the report that I've just talked about. So some of it is the kind of reports and commissioning, some of the reports that we've commissioned, some of the analysis that we've undertaken. But I think there's also actually the way in which we have started to look at how we could commission and involve the voice of the users or the communities. I think it's enhanced because it's a very cross-cutting programme, so we are working across the organisation. And we have been very deliberate and will continue to be about the importance of putting those community voices and young people at the heart of the solutions we're developing. And one example of that, which felt very, very different and is obviously only one event, but nonetheless it sort of speaks, I think, quite strongly, was when we held a young people's event here. And about 250, 300 young people came in the living room upstairs, at which the Mayor also spoke. They were all young people who were either involved in their youth offending team or they were involved in their pupil referral units. So perhaps trying to take us out a little bit of some of the most obvious kind of relationships we have and bringing in new voices into, literally in that case, into the building, but actually into our work and into the way we're trying to shape our thinking.
So you think having an event would stop crime or
I don't think that's what
issues?
I said, actually. I thought your question was around how we'd influenced. And in terms of influencing, I think there was many different ways in which you can influence culture, and that was an illustration of one way in which you could do that.
I'm trying to find out what you're doing that's different, that might solve some of the issues in London and what you might think is key to that. I mean, what is the VRU identified as a key issue facing London's communities? What is a key issue?
Well, I mean, there are very many key issues, but if I could just come back to your previous point for a moment, the key thing that we have done, and I think the influence that we've got, is around partnership. So we are working very closely with the Metropolitan Police, we're working very closely with the NHS, we're working very closely with education, local authorities, and probation indeed as well. And those are key public sector partners that we are working together to establish that violence is a priority they each need to work on, and that we as different organisations can all bring together our data, we can also all bring together our programmes, and that the sum of the parts is greater than one organisation individually doing that. And that's important to me because violence, in the way that it manifests itself, or the way rather that violence happens, is a whole huge range of contributory causes, and so all of those agencies need to be part of the solution. So just to try and get at your other bit of difference or your other bit of culture, that was how I would probably try and address that. In terms of, you know, what are key issues, well, I've mentioned drug supply is a big issue, alienation of young people is a big issue. You know, young people being excluded from school has a very direct correlation with, you know, young people getting caught up in violence.
Yeah, my query is I would have thought that had been assumed before through MOPAC. It certainly has been assumed before by many of us. We didn't need somebody to be telling us that because I think we all knew that anyway. But of these communities that you're now engaged with, what are the key asks from them?
The key asks from them are to really have some good solid evaluation so that they can work out what is actually making an impact. There's a huge range of activity going on across London, but actually the evaluation around some of those projects is much scarcer. So that's the first. The second is around the nature of funding. There is a lot of short-term funding initiatives which, you know, see small organisations in particular spending an awful lot of time filling in forms and filling in KPIs, but actually their talent is less in that area and much more in the relationships that they can strike up at a local level. So a sense of longer term sustainable funding I think is really, really important.
Well, we've been saying that for years, haven't we? But, I mean, we
Well,
all accept that. We've all been saying it for years.
Yeah.
I mean, what opportunities have been identified by the VRU to pave the way for significant reductions in violence now and for future generations? What would you say?
What would I say are the key things that we should be investing in to see some change around?
Well, yes, what have you identified that's different to what we all have been listening to for years?
Well, I don't think I'm going to convince you of what's different, but I'm
please do try, because you've got a wonderful opportunity with lots of money. We really want to hear.
What I'm going to try and convince you on is the different focus and the different way that you do some of these things. So, for example, exclusions is a really good example of that. So you would say, and probably rightly, that people have identified the fact that exclusions has a direct correlation with violence. But to tackle that, and the bit I'm interested in is the action rather than the talking about the problems endlessly. And the action is, what do we do about that? And when we went up to Glasgow and we spoke to the Director of Education in Glasgow, we got a very clear pointer as to how we could go about addressing that issue. And I think it's important to highlight the importance of that. Over a decade, an 81% reduction in exclusions also correlated to a 48% reduction in violence. So I think she's got some important things to say. And one of the things that she was saying and could demonstrate was that rather than setting up a campaign to say no more exclusions, the thing that you should be investing in is an exclusive schools programme. And some of the work that an organisation, or different organisations, but one of which we are now funding, called Nurture UK, does exactly that. It's not looking just at the kids in isolation from the rest of the institution. It's looking at how you can support the teachers in that role. And that has made a huge impact, and we therefore are investing some money in that in schools across London. The other thing that we know is that that transition between primary and secondary school is a really important part, a gap where kids get lost. So how can we fund and how can we learn from the programmes that already exist that strengthen that and make that less likely?
Okay, well,
so those are the kind of different approaches and the different investments that's needed around over those priority areas, so they don't just become the same thing that we're talking about in 5 years' time.
That's a good example. How much money have you put into that?
So there's 4.7 million gone into supporting schools. Not all of that is into that one particular programme, but it is through those, there's actually three programmes, one of which is the primary to secondary, two of which are more focused on secondary schools, one of which is the Nurture UK. There's also, some of the boroughs are doing really interesting pilots of training up teachers around sort of trauma-informed work, which we are supporting, and then some of the other areas that are important is around the after-school provision and also how you give more support to the pupil referral units. So as a package around how we are investing, that it was quite a sizable amount of our overall investment for this year.
Okay,
and because we think it's important. Yeah.
And that will, of course, and that will help schools in the whole of London or every area in London.
So through the local violence reduction plans, we are asking boroughs to all make a focus on this as an issue, but the actual targeted investment that we're talking about is going to 16 different boroughs.
16?
So it's not the same amount of money for each of the boroughs, no. But each of the boroughs is in receipt of some money that will help them to address this issue.
Okay. Do you want me to carry on, or do you want Sean? I'm mindful of the time.
No, just finish off.
Yeah, okay. So going back to my theme here, what did the findings of the Strategic Needs Assessment that you published, that was late, wasn't it, in 2020, January, what did it tell us that we didn't already know? What highlight a couple of things to us that you found out that we as a group listening to these things for a long time?
Well, I think it was the first time a figure had been put on the economic or the financial cost of violence. And so for the last year, it assessed that at 3 billion. And I think that is a very important statistic to use in why we should be putting more investment into prevention. And so that's certainly one that you'll be hearing from us quite a lot, because I think it just makes the case incredibly well, and that's just looking at it from a financial perspective, and that's not even the emotional and social costs of violence. So that was something that was new. I think it also highlighted something which you may have known, but I think is a really important thing, is that bringing together the different statutory reviews that have to happen doesn't necessarily mean that there is a statutory review of every homicide that takes place in London. And I think what that did was powerfully make the case for us to advocate that after each homicide there should be a statutory review. This is the other document, if that's okay. This is the accompanying document, which is looking at the reviews that have taken place. So I think that's something that we absolutely need to advocate for. I think it gave a very powerful profile of some of that neighbourhood level violence that I referred to earlier on, that perhaps doesn't come as a huge surprise, but I think it underlined the importance of working at that level, and certainly gave us the impetus to do that going forward and the direction. So it looked, for example, at why there are areas which there's a strong correlation between some of those areas that have been most affected by poverty and deprivation, but there are actually some of those areas which are also in that bracket of poverty and deprivation that aren't as badly affected by violence. So can we use that to tease out what are the key differences? It emphasised the point we've just been talking about, which is around schools, which perhaps isn't new, but as I said, it's new how we deal with it. And it started to look at drugs, actually, which is really important as well, and the change in the drugs market. So obviously there's interesting work being done around the analysis that supports some of the work around county lines and the way we tackle it, but that was also useful.
So I'm sure it's all useful, and it's just how much has been done before. Is MOPAC then reducing some of the work they do? Because I think lots of us had assumed MOPAC was doing a lot of that. So is workloads moving from MOPAC to you?
I wouldn't put it like that. I mean, I suppose I'd look at it in a slightly different way. I mean, there is a huge challenge. This is a number one priority for Londoners. Without doing down any of the work that has previously been done, collectively, we've not managed to crack this as a problem. So the idea that we need to put both more emphasis, more resource, and try and do things in a different way seems to me to be absolutely the right approach. I mean, we know, just by the statistics alone, that we haven't as yet made enough of an impact.
No, we know
so
indeed.
That's why that was the Mayor's intention to set up a violence reduction unit, was to learn from places that had adopted that approach, and Glasgow was one such example.
We do indeed accept that whatever the Mayor is doing is not working, so something needs to be done. The assessment reported that violent crime has become more serious and more frequent, likely driven by an increase in the use of knives. So what's your reaction to that? And how is the VRU going to respond to that?
So I'm just going to go back, if you don't mind, to that one other question. I think there is a real danger in just associating this with a sort of short-term perspective. I think we've got a problem here that requires a long-term solution, and I think it is really important, therefore, that we adopt that approach in how we tackle violence.
Yeah,
and that's why it was really good. Yeah, I can then answer the question. I think it's really important, therefore, that the Home Office then decided to set up 17 more violence reduction units. I think it's really important that the lesson we learn from Glasgow is it is a long-term. It's a long-term.
Yeah. Can you answer, because we're stuck on time? Can you answer the question about the knives?
Yes, I mean, I think that the statistics say, there's an increase of homicide or knife-enabled homicide that is of concern, and that we need to be looking at both, why knives are the things that are being used, but recognise that if we just focus on knives to the exclusion of why people are committing more violence, then we'll be in a different situation in a few years' time.
I'm just trying to get proper answers. What is your reaction to that? We all know it's that. How is the VRU going to respond?
Well, I mentioned an example earlier on.
On the knife issue?
Yes, exactly, yeah. On the it was actually called Knife Crime Seed Funding, to those groups that are across London, and we're going to be evaluating their work at a neighbourhood level. We are going to be looking at the way imagery is used around knives. We are talking to young people about why they feel perhaps insecure in their environment, so that they're actually using knives. So I think there's a whole range of things, from how you support groups that are addressing that issue specifically, as well as the culture around knives and the culture around violence. So there's a whole suite of different things we'd be doing.
That you will be doing?
Well, some of it we are doing, because we've talked about the programme that we've done, and some of it we will be doing. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I will move on, Chair.
Sean.
Thank you. Yes, so I wanted to focus on the second document that you sort of referred to, which is the analysis of the statutory reviews of homicides and violent incidents, which is incredibly interesting and has a number of recommendations. Do you accept all of those recommendations? Are there any you'd highlight as being the most useful, or ones you might disagree with?
No, there isn't anything at the moment I would disagree with, no. I do think that the key recommendation is around the absence of statutory reviews for young people under 18 who haven't been or aren't deemed to have been affected by abuse or neglect. And therefore I think we are, and I think this comes through very strongly in actually that report, that we're missing a really important part of the jigsaw, and that we really need to be able to, I think, well, we've written obviously to government to request that they consider that, and it would be really important that there is some investment that follows that for local authorities. But I think that's what it really exposes.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely clear. Just for the record, the reviews they looked at were the domestic homicide reviews, the independent investigation reviews, which are only where someone's been subject to mental health or care, serious case reviews, which are to do with child safeguarding, and the safeguarding adult reviews, where there's evidence of really serious neglect in an adult, and those are obviously quite limited and don't cover a lot of the concerning cases, and getting to the bottom of what happened with those is really important, I think.
Yeah.
Some of the cases they outline are really shocking. The level of other issues there are in people's lives who end up either committing or being murdered is terrifying, and that's across the board of all the different kinds of murders that were looked at. And I think, we do have some serious work to do. One thing that I wondered about was neither of these documents mention any communication or evidence gathering via the Victims Commissioner, which seems odd because she is obviously doing lots of work with victims who overlap with perpetrators as well, as we know. It's possible she may be able to help fill some of the gaps in the meantime through some of the victims she's in touch with, who might be prepared to share learning from their stories. I wondered if you'd looked at that, or what.
I think that's an important point, and something we could definitely look at, and we work with Claire on the work that she's doing, so I think that's a sensible suggestion, Sean.
Okay, another one of the, obviously the recommendation one, which says we need more statutory reviews, is useful. That relates to sort of government taking wider action. Another one that potentially does is recommendation 6, which oddly is worded differently in the main body of the report than it is in the summary. In the summary, it asks about whether you've got the right balance between wider population-based primary prevention services and support for those at immediate risk. Later on in the report, when it gives the recommendation again, it says actually it would like you to focus on violence as an immediate risk, in addition to population-based primary prevention, which is not the same question as what's the balance. What are your thoughts on this? Because obviously I've been advocating for very wide, very broad youth services, but we also support, for example, the youth workers who work in A&E, people who have already been injured. You've got, you illustrated quite well earlier on some learning that you'd had about support for schools to make them more resilient to prevent exclusions, rather than just focusing on excluded pupils, which again is the same kind of question. You might consider at that point putting youth workers into schools, for example, as well as police officers. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on that recommendation, because it is, I say, it doesn't seem completely clear what they're saying, and there are lots of questions about where you put resources that come out of that recommendation.
I think you've identified the balance, and that's quite hard, and that's almost something that we need to keep testing, because you need both, don't you? You're trying to build a resilient community in the shape of, as you discussed at school, and that does require a kind of universal application of a programme versus actually using the evidence of, ACEs, for example, would be one such, adverse childhood experience, and looking at the number of ACEs that one, young person is subjected to means that, their threshold, it's not predetermined by any means, but their threshold of getting caught up in violence therefore massively increases, which looks at a much more tailored approach. So I think it's quite a difficult balance, but one that we acknowledge, and I think we'll probably get more and more kind of au fait with as we continue the kind of programme.
Yeah, and I can add to that in terms of the early intervention piece, which I think we want to build on, because we see that as really important, and potentially we are better placed to help convene that to happen. There's lots of great things happening across London. Often that shared learning, it doesn't happen. It's easier said than done. I think once you're in your own borough, that isn't shared, and our citizens across London don't really work inside their own borough. They do represent across the whole of London. So in terms of making sure that we better equipped youth practitioners to be able to respond better and earlier, see the signs earlier, so that then that can help the knock-on effect through a child's journey that then go on to adulthood and also experience those adverse experiences that we often talk about just in children, then impacts on other children and their siblings and parenting. So in terms of equipping youth practitioners, that early intervention, identify the signs, that's helpful, and also through the parenting lens, to pick up those signs earlier.
That's really useful, thank you. So moving on to multi-agency working, which obviously comes out of quite a few of the individual cases. Again, we've got this level of scale. You talked about that your partnerships include the NHS, the Education Service, the police. The other report that talks about the neighbourhood level variations is very interesting too. So there's a level at which you might be working, which is at a ward level, and I'm a ward councillor, so I also have that perspective there as well, to link up the different agencies at a ward level. And I wondered what work you were doing on that. Obviously the Mayor was highlighting earlier on that the struggles that we're having with equipping wards with enough officers from the police. What scope do you have of focusing more resources or encouraging more agency work at ward level or at neighbourhood level, as this seems to suggest should happen?
Yeah, we have got a section covered now, but I'll defer to Charlotte.
It's about the other agencies more than it is about the... Yeah.
No, carry on, sorry.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right that we want to, operate at both of those levels. And I think that, what you get from the sort of broader partnership that the Mayor assembled through the Partnership Reference Group, and are all very senior members, senior people within those organisations, is you get that kind of buy-in to ask an organisation to do and make sure that working at that local level is actually happening. So, for example, the NHS would be a good example of saying, well, we need the statistics across London, but it would then be making sure that's translated into something at a local level that actually happens. So using that kind of collective partnership to drive the right kind of information at a local level is important. But, as a former ward councillor, and the importance of that kind of local place-based stuff and developing relationships, I don't think we can do that from here. I think what we can do is facilitate and assist it, and make sure that there is the relevant focus. And that's why the borough violence reduction plans have been a very useful way of starting that conversation, because what we've done there is assist the boroughs in turning them from what started off as just knife crime action strategies into something that is much more relevant and pertinent to their place, that are much more systematic, in the sense that you could compare the different borough plans now in a way that you probably couldn't have done 2 years ago around the knife crime action plans. And the importance of that is then that you're able to promote good practice in one borough to another borough, and that you're able to begin to both build up a local picture but build up a comprehensive sort of London picture.
Can I just ask quickly? Can I just ask quickly about the NHS as well? Because obviously the geographic information there potentially that would be very helpful to the NHS if they're going to train GPs to do more to spot signs of refer people. But there are not, I mean, talk about boroughs, we've probably got good links with boroughs in this building. Potentially not so much with the NHS. I wondered if you were pursuing that side of things as well.
Yeah, we certainly are. So, I mean, in many different ways. I know the Mayor has a regular meeting with, David Sloman, who's the head of the NHS in London. We're well represented by the head of commissioning of NHS in the Partnership Reference Group. We've had roundtables with health colleagues. We're obviously working on some joint areas, or certainly we're investing in some programmes that are in the health arena, such as IRIS as an example, but there's other ones as well. So yeah, those partnerships are being definitely struck up, and we're trying to make sure that they're also operating at that kind of borough level where we think the change is most important.
And they'll be able to use this evidence now to target
their
resources.
So they've all had that evidence, and what we want to be able to do from those reports is make sure that we do, follow that up and look at, as a partnership, not just as a unit, but as a partnership, what are the kind of things that they can help address, so that we are working collectively.
So the only thing I was going to mention, which is supplementary to that, is the project that we're doing with the Information Commissioner's Office, where we are looking at better use of data across public health, other health organisations, as well as police, local ambulance service data, to really look at combining that to see how best we can use that on a level in terms of Pan-London level, but also lower down ward level. So what we will learn from that one-year project, we want to then be in a position to be able to share that learning down to the boroughs so that they can use their data better, because within a borough there are lots of agencies together, such as within the MASH scenario, but they're often stuck how to best use their own data. So if they can learn how to better use their data, they can also focus their own resources better locally as well. So that'll help inform that.
When you say you're working with the Information Commissioner's Office, that's data protection related. That's to help with anonymising or making data more shareable without breaching.
So this is so the Information Commissioner's Office puts out a round of applications in terms of supporting pilot projects to happen over a one-year period. So we won that application to be able to trial. It's almost like a card of 12 months. You can trial this for 12 months and we'll support you to do that. As part of that, we will work with the Information Commissioner's Office in terms of looking at our own data to make sure we're using it as best we can, including the building as well. So we've opened up the doors to that, which I think is a really positive step. So lots of people do think in terms of the Information Commissioner is offering around that, but actually they do open the doors to look at pilot projects for innovative solutions to using data.
Great. It's a positive opportunity for us actually to bring sort of a partnership approach to data and really unblock some of those challenges and make sure that organisations that sometimes hide behind data protection as an issue, and sometimes it's actually a cultural issue of sharing, feel the confidence of the ICO saying, no, this is fine, you can share this.
Yeah, that's useful, thank you.
Thank you. For the next section on local delivery, so Member Stu O'Connell, I'm sure you'll split things on.
I'll do my best, Chair. And much of this has been covered already, but on the theme of local delivery, I think we all understand the massive importance of local delivery. When we visited Birmingham, which is a far better model comparable to Glasgow, of course, the local delivery was most important. Now, we've heard about potential, and you've answered that, risks of duplication with MOPAC, and that's been answered in that exchange. But what's always struck me is what the boroughs are already doing and also emerging. So, for example, I will quote, of course I always do, Croydon has already a mature, drawn-up model of the VRU. So I'm interested in the issue about potential duplication with what boroughs are already doing, or additionality. Now, I understand you're targeting 16 boroughs, so you're deliberately working with certain boroughs, but tell me a little bit briefly about how you avoid duplication of what they're already doing on the ground.
Okay,
Please.
well, first off, I think you go out, visit and listen and work with them on their borough plans, and that's something that we've done really consistently and to good effect, so that we are not sort of just kind of coming up with ideas from here and then sort of landing them in boroughs. It's making sure a completely different approach. And so the violence reduction plans that each borough has now developed has been done so in collaboration.
Is this the
well,
knife crime?
It was the originally knife crime strategies, and we've now broadened that to violence reduction.
Yeah.
And as part of doing that, that's cementing local partnerships. It's also bringing the VRU alongside the Met Police, alongside London councils, into a kind of advisory and support role. And that really helps to make sure that we're not doing sort of two different kind of but similar types of activity.
Well, it's all about additionality, as has been brought out
exactly,
earlier.
yeah.
There are some boroughs
So-
who have been, they will say they've been very good at this sort of model, but clearly many haven't because of the issues we've got out there.
Yeah.
So what the important thing we're trying to glean, and we measure it in the KPIs, is the additionality, not just the extra funding, but the additionality that's going on the ground.
Well, I mean, I think the additionality is partly in having those kind of conversations. It's about the peer support we're able to offer for those boroughs, which they've all been very receptive to receiving. It's about we facilitated the first of, I am absolutely certain, many events, which was the lead for violence in the Met, myself, and the lead for crime and protection across London as the chief exec, Caroline Downs from Brent, an event at which we had about 85 people come along, making sure that all of the boroughs and all of the BCUs were represented. And in fact, there was a fair smattering of chief executives from London boroughs there as well. And that's important because I think it kind of acknowledges that there is both a role for each of those local areas in developing the plans and wanting to make that connection and making sure that they're working with us around how they're doing that, but also sharing info.
Okay,
So
but
that's
the
really
approach
important.
is not, initially the approach was the Pan-London approach. That was refined because the studies say that it's the geographical base of the issues. So you've now brought it down to something like 16 targeted boroughs, but you still have an expectation every borough provides a plan and does some work around it, whilst you may not be directly supporting those boroughs. Is that the kind of model?
Yeah, I mean, we are directly supporting all of the boroughs. I wouldn't want you to carry
just
away, get away with just the 16. We're doing all of the boroughs.
Right.
But another example of how we would be doing that and making sure that we're strengthening local networks and not duplicating is when we had when we looked at doing the investment around the schools programme. What we did, rather than was bypass the local authority, we made sure that we went through to the local authority and asked them which schools that they were particularly concerned about in their area, and that if we had funding, would they want to make the approach to those local schools? And I think, again, that's important because it's strengthening local relationships rather than just kind of coming in and bypassing the kind of local scene. So we've done that with all of our funding, and in a similar way, when we've supported community groups in different boroughs, we've made sure that we've used either the local CVS or indeed the local authority to talk to them about where our investment's going. So that way, I think you're making connections, and that way you're making sure that that sort of duplication of effort isn't.
That was my point really. When you
forward.
mentioned the CVS, I fondly call the CVA in my neck of the woods. I mean, they already have mature organisations, well networking with communities, and you're working very much with those particular groups.
Absolutely, yeah. And sorry, can I just add one other thing? I know we're short of time, but I think it is quite important just to kind of perhaps flavour what I'm trying to say. I mean, last night, for example, Karina went to Waltham Forest because their scrutiny committee there had asked if she'd go along and talk to them about the work of the Violence Reduction Unit. Sarah Hayward, who you will know, Steve, heads up the Violence Reduction Unit in Croydon, was also there. So it's not kind of a one-off thing. It's a fairly dynamic, constant relationship we've got with the VIUs in London. Of course, we've got that same now with the 18 across the UK, where we're all learning from each other, and we've got our own network established, and we're one of the key groups on the Home Office.
Thank you. Londoners are keen, obviously, to hear about what the Mayor and the building is doing about violent crime crisis out there. They understand the Met Police and what they do. Do Londoners out there understand the VRU and what that really means? How is that being imparted to Londoners that actually there's a lot of taxpayers' investment going into this model? Londoners, are they being told about what's going on out there? How are we relaying that? I mean, other than you talking to the people in the know, in the boroughs, is there a communications plan, not an expensive one, I hope, but a plan to tell Londoners? No, not an expensive
one. I mean, I think there's two answers to that question. I mean, the first, which I think is the really important bit, is rather than the actual unit itself and its name, is to establish how important it is to invest in ridding us of the causes of violence, and that preventative piece, and therefore that figure of 3 billion in the review that I referred to earlier on is really important, and the Mayor's spoken about that on many occasions, and that becomes now a consistent theme of people, I think, working with, talking to, approaching that issue across all of City Hall, and that's important. In terms of the Violence Reduction Unit ourselves, yes, we have a website. We feature on the website. It does need updating. We, obviously communicate with a wide group of people through our newsletter that goes out every month. And we, I think I mentioned earlier on, have attended, way in excess of 100 different kind of community visits and groups. But so it's more systematic than just having those conversations. But I think it's important both as a unit, but also actually as a theme around prevention.
My last big question really is about, you mentioned specific groups that you work with and you fund, and there's, I can see 100 in my briefing note, and you mentioned something like that. Obviously, when the VRU was introduced, communities out there were getting quite excited about that. It sounds like new funding. This is going back about 18 months, and we all probably were contacted by groups saying, we hear about this, how do we get in contact? You've whittled it, not whittled it down is the wrong word, but you've now chosen certain groups to work with. I don't want a long debate about it, but how have you arrived at those specific groups? How have they evidenced? Have you worked with them to say, we'll work with you, probably because it's geographical, but tell me just very briefly about your rationale about working with certain groups as opposed to others.
Well, we have to have a transparent process when we are awarding money, and we've got that.
Public money,
So I think that's absolutely key, and we need to then match up either a focus on a particular area, so making sure that there's no duplication there, so it's evidence-based, or we need to make sure where there's a gap, so, or where we know something's working, and then we make sure that we're funding those. So, in essence, although it's really important to have, I think, that relationship with the organisation, that doesn't take precedence over where that group's located, the impact of the work that they're doing, or the transparency of the process in awarding them any money.
Okay, that's fine, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on to the penultimate section, questions on funding from Assemblyman Bashar.
Thank you, Chair. I want to pick up two funding allocations related to VRU. The first one being the one which was awarded by Home Office for 2019-20, a fund of £7 million. What criteria has the VRU used to allocate this funding to boroughs?
The main way in which we looked at allocation of funding to any borough programme was bringing together a data set so we could look at where we thought the problem was most acute. And what we made sure we did was not just use crime data, but that we used public health data, and that we used some of the perceptions of violence in that area as well, so that we were tackling holistically what we thought were the issues in that particular borough. So in terms of then borough spend, we, in terms of just purely for the local violence reduction plans, we then use that information to give an additional bit of funding to the boroughs that are most affected by violence under using that tool, or the ones that were then a bit more affected than some others. And so we had sort of 3 tiers of funding, but each of the London boroughs got funding. For other programmes, it very much depended on what the precise nature of the issue was. So going back to 2 examples I've given previously, in terms of schools and schools work, it was again looking at some of the boroughs that both had a problem and that were most receptive to spending that money and were keen to work with us around the schools programme. In terms of IRIS, which was the domestic violence and awareness programme that I talked about earlier on in relation to doctors, it was where we knew there wasn't a scheme, but we knew that there was a problem. So we tailored it to that gap. So across all of the programmes it's varied, but in terms of the boroughs it was that data tool.
My next question is about funding for schools-related VRU activities, but sticking to the first one on Home Office funding. Yes, I accept what you're saying is that depending on borough profile, data and so on, you look at the funding. Would you also at that point in time actually identify from your end as well as from the related borough the actual projects or activities, expanded activities that would be required, and therefore actually designate funding related to the program rather than purely on data. How does the process actually work is what I'm trying to understand.
Okay. So yes, we asked each of the boroughs in particular within their violence reduction plans to focus on three things. One was around supply and context of the drugs market and drug-related violence. The second was around the exclusions, and the third was around reoffending. So we were particularly looking at proposals to come forward on those three issues. In terms of, it would vary then depending on other programmes. So yes, we're not just kind of saying, oh, you're a borough that's most affected, here's a pot of money, you go and do what you want with it. It's looking at the priorities that we've identified across London and making sure that they've got plans to address those. If you want to add anything.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add on that is that then supported a lot of boroughs to extend programmes that they felt worked locally in terms of a longer term solution, so for an additional 2 years, which often boroughs don't always get to have in terms of that longer term provision.
Yeah. I'm not sure how long the scheme's been running for, but are you able to tell us how you are measuring the success, or how, or monitoring the programs as to how they're spanning out and whether they're doing the business they're meant to do?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, each of the programmes that we've invested in has a set of, what would be known as KPIs, so key performance indicators.
Yeah.
So everything has got a process by which we can evaluate its effectiveness. Yeah. And it varies hugely from which programme we're talking about, but I'm happy if you've got an interest in one of those programmes to, if I'm able to send you the key performance indicators related to it. Yeah.
I think that would be useful information to have.
To indicate which, because there's obviously a lot of programmes we're funding, I'm very happy to do that. Yeah.
And are you satisfied that the programme is actually working in making that difference at ground level?
Well, that's what we hope to obviously test. It's quite early days in terms of our investments to be able to get a strong sense of evaluation, unless the programmes have been running elsewhere before we added additional resource. But clearly it's an absolutely key thing for us to work out, what's going to have success and what isn't.
I suppose the only other thing is to add to that, there are a small number of pilot projects also happening which are quite new, and we've encouraged boroughs to think of new innovative programmes that maybe hasn't got an evidence base previously, just to see and test out actually new ways of working, because sometimes we often lead too much into the outcomes base, therefore often new programmes and new ideas aren't able to then start and test, taking that on board, that it's important to test new things as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be good for committee to have maybe a list of various projects or programmes that are being worked at across London, including the pilots that you mentioned. That will give us some handle of, what the shape of those expanded activities are like. Yeah, thank you. Moving on to the next investment, which is from the Mayor. Where he announced that VRU is investing 4.7 million in a series of programs to tackle school exclusions and support vulnerable young Londoners through educational programs. How will the Mayor use this fund?
So we've used this fund in probably three main ways. The first is that we've established through a process of tendering to award three different programmes the opportunity to go into schools in 16 of the boroughs. So one of those is Tender UK, confusingly when you're talking about tendering, but it's Tender UK. The other one is Nurture UK, and the other one is the Stepping Stones programme that is actually developed in the GLA. So each of the 16 boroughs have got the ability to put together those three programmes and let the schools within the borough use them. So that's one area in which we spent some of the money. The second is we had some great proposals come through, which were even smaller kind of pilots, but came through the Young Londoners Fund application process. Some of those felt very related to exclusions and felt like a really interesting projects for us in the Violence Reduction Unit to look at their evaluation and look at their impact. So we funded 5 of those. And then the third is the element that we want to fund, which is more around the school day and the fact that we know between the hours of 4 and 7 is less safe for young people, and how can we make sure that we're supporting the kind of diversionary activities that give them something to do, but hopefully give them, a little bit more, a few more strings to their bow and give them something interesting to engage them in. So those are the 3 main elements in which we've spent that money.
How are the schools engaging or responding to the program? Do you find that there's any capacity issues with schools in order to engage properly with the VRU activities?
Well, it's early days.
Yeah.
I think that's worth saying. But the programmes are not meant to be an added workload for the schools, because it's very clear when you read some of the reviews we've talked about that one of the things that's been an issue and has contributed to violence is the cuts that schools have received, along with many other public sector agencies as well. So what you wouldn't want to do is put schools which are hard pressed under more pressure to go and do something else. So it's very much about looking at the systems that they've already got in place and seeing how they can roll out a programme that supports the whole school environment. So very alert to that,
Okay. One last question on this one. How will the VRU be working with schools, police officers, which we know are growing in numbers, to tackle youth violence?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
How will the schools be working? How will the VRU be working with schools, police officers?
Oh, within the schools, yeah. So I think that's a really important part of the work, is making sure that all of the assets you've got in a school are all working in the same direction and all communicating together. We held, in fact, it was organised by the Secondi we've got from the Met Police. We held an event probably about 6 weeks ago now, which brought together schools, police officers, to talk about how we can all, do that bigger piece of work within the school environment. And, it was very, very, very positive, and I think we learned quite a lot from it, and I think so did the police officers that were represented. There was about 50 of them there, I think, from different schools across London. So I think that's an important part of what we do.
Thank you. That's all from me.
Bring Asylbima Duval in. Just a quick question, which maybe I should have asked of the Mayor. So currently there are 320 something schools officers, and I think London needs about 600 and something, 640 from memory. Do you know if the Mayor's got any plans to expand this, the number of schools?
I wouldn't want to question the chair. I think it's more than actually 320 now. I thought it's increasing all of the time, and I think it is an important part of how we make our schools safer.
Right, but you're not aware of any plans to, well, the information I had about...
We haven't got any plans, no, as the Violence Reduction Unit. I know it's an aspiration of the Mayor, and he obviously works very closely with the Commissioner, who is very, supportive of this agenda. So, watch this space, really.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wasn't going to participate today, but I was listening very carefully about what you were saying about the education issues. And, in terms of the main tenet of the public health approach, more of the same isn't going to work. Mm-hmm. What I didn't hear is so let's take pupil referral units. Mm-hmm. So when can we envisage that there'll be a new way of working around pupil referral units across the entire part of London? If, I'm not one for acting like we're in crisis, but if the violence issue and the trend issue, and we want the propensity for those that may go into crime or not, I'm not saying everyone in a pupil referral unit is, but it's highly likely, when will we see a change of working across the piece? So, let's put you down on that. What's the expectation here? And, I've got some further questions, but let's start with that one first, because that seems to be a bit of a priority, and I might expect a bit of quick and fast action of thinking where the experts are coming together and saying this is a bit of a problem area.
Yeah, I think it is a really important issue. I mean, just in the last month or so, we visited several pupil referral units, and the variation in the quality of accommodation, the quality of education and expectation is absolutely huge. So there is absolutely something about how you level up what the pupil referral units are doing, I think, which is really important. I think in terms of our work, focusing in on the pupil referral units and the support that we can add, and that was obviously part of the conversations we've been having with the ones that we visited, is important. What are the opportunities for the young people that are already in there? How can we enhance their ability once they get out of there, or indeed while they're in there, is something that we're looking at in terms of funding. And there are some really good, interesting schemes. I don't know if you've come across The Difference, which is an organisation I only relatively recently became acquainted with, but they're doing a really interesting piece of work where they're taking high flyers from teachers from the mainstream education setting, training them up, and they're working in pupil referral units with the expectation then that they will also go back into the mainstream education, so that you're beginning to get an appreciation of all of the different kinds of pupils, and that you're bringing kind of that experience together, which I think is really positive. So
Okay.
pupil reference on our radar.
So when will I see change?
Well, I'd hope we'd be able
Which academic year is there going to be a sea change in the way that we're dealing with that group of vulnerable youngsters who may even hurt themselves or go on to hurt others? What's the change?
I mean, the change is, I think, in the first instance, a reduction in the numbers going into pupil referral units. I think the next change is a improvement in the quality of all pupil referral units, but more importantly is the outcomes of the young people there. And certainly that's one of the programmes we're looking to invest in next year, and some of the networking that we need to do. And so I would hope that in a year's time we'd have a more positive picture that we could draw on. I think it's good that there are many more schools talking about it. I think it's really good that there was a receptiveness to the nurturing programme that we put out. I think it's good, actually, that the Eton Standard's done something on it.
I buy all that. I don't mind the discussion and the awareness. It's a question of actions now.
Yeah.
When do things change? When can we expect change? And I think what's the best practice, what works. I don't mind a thousand flowers blooming as long as it's moving in the right direction and about the judgment calls. But I think we and Londoners can now start to say, what does it look like? We know there's a particular problem. This isn't the be-all and end-all. It's not the silver bullet. But we know this is an issue where people are saying it's not working, it's under pressure. What can we expect? What's a percentage can we expect by next year? What would we expect afterwards? And see where we can then monitor to see if it makes a difference. The reason why I asked this, because there was a lot of crazy thinking, abolish pupil referral units and everything will be all right. I'm not one of those. I think it's about changing working practices and seeing where things work. What I want to know is what's the advice, who's driving the change and where it is. Let's move on then, because we're not going to get somewhere on this one, but maybe you could come back to us and tell us some of that thinking around that. Now, tell me, who controls schools? In the 1990s, I used to say to people, local authorities don't show schools. It was pretty radical then, because we used to pretend we did, and we didn't. So I expect local authorities would be on board of trying to influence schools in what they can do. Have government ministers sent a letter round to the schools that they control, telling them to engage in this practice? Is there any concerted effort? Because I'm always thinking there's a few resistors out there. In terms of my experience about not wanting to, one, be engaged in some of these activities, and I take it that actually we're discussing it more and more, but where are people in signing up for the agenda to change? Now, I understand working environments and the pressure from cuts are there, but actually this isn't something where they've still got to change. And there's got to be a degree of openness in schools. They're in I found some schools that are not willing to recognise what's going in their schools, from bullying to sexual assaults to actually dealing with those issues. So where is government coming, because they're committed to the public health approach, supporting you in London and sending the message to the schools they control? I don't give a toss whether it's a minister or a senior civil servant, but someone who holds some levers of power, because I don't think we can avoid a voluntary approach to this issue on public health. So it's great to hear you all talking about it, but I want to see some seesaw change. You're putting some money on the table. The fact that we have to put money on the table to get people to engage, I'm a bit worried about. But nevertheless, that's all good, and we want to support that. But again, where are the milestones about some of the changes we want to see? And of course, I do think the prevention bit, but I want to see where the enforcement bit's in, whether the prevention stroke police officers are in there. So that's the bit I'm trying to get to the bottom with. Where is this real push for a desire to get a different outcome from the past? More of the same doesn't work.
No, well, I mean, I completely agree with you that there isn't a strategic lead with power in London or indeed anywhere around schools, and I think that's a huge absence. And I think it's telling that when we set up a partnership reference groups and had all the main agencies represented, it was very hard to know who you got to represent education, because you haven't got that anymore, and local education authorities aren't there. So it is much more influence rather than power. Within that, I think it's really important, and indeed the Mayor was very vocal in 2018 about how exclusion rates needed to come down, and he first articulated the kind of correlation between that and violence. And so therefore I think there is a really persuading, influencing role in the absence of anybody actually having the power that he can play that important role. And certainly we're using that influence to make sure that we are trying to get somewhere on this issue. And what that then means, I think, in terms of the programmes you're talking about is, sadly, it does mean it is slightly working with a coalition of the willing to make the case for how important it is. And that's why I think our funding is important. But what you would really hope is something different. You'd hope for a different landscape. So within that, I think we do need to look for some change around the pupils that we've helped who are in the pupil referral units within a year. We do need to set up and evaluate some of the schemes that are already running. I think it will help that there's money from the skills budget going from a different part of this building going specifically into supporting some of those young people in terms of skills, and we'll be able to measure that. And I think it's really important that we go through the boroughs and boost the networks existing in the boroughs, albeit absolutely alert to the fact that the local council hasn't got the power to get those schools that aren't any good around the table.
Okay, well, my starter for 10, Ofsted inspections controlled by government, those schools need to be called out and exposed and challenged and brought back in. Can you put that in your work programme? Can we do that? I think we'd be supportive of that. Secondly, can we make it clear? My colleague said something that made me think. I was doing some work about the awareness issue. Isn't there not a case, because government signed up for this as well, that the mayor and government and the local leader of the borough write a letter to all their schools saying, actually, we recognise you're under pressure, but this is also under pressure, and you are key to the long-term prevention of violent crime in our societies, and you've got to play a part, and there's no ifs or buts, there's no choice in this. And somehow we've got to do this because people think there's a choice. Because if we're really going to make a big impact, whether it's domestic violence or violence against others, then we've got to get in at a very young stage, whether it's primary, secondary or not. That must be your long-term objective. I think we've got to look at some acceleration issues here, or we'll be back here in a number of years' time, all be saying, woe is me, it's not working, and you'll still be working with a coalition of the willing rather than actually across the bit. And we've got to strengthen your hand on this. So somehow I'd like to see some more injection of pace and more about that we are facing a potential crisis here, and I think we see that with some of the tragedies that we see on streets. They've all got stories, victims and perpetrators of the crime alike. What are we going to do about that? Yeah, we need to have a special session on education, I think, a much more longer depth one, but we need to get to grips, and we need to empower you to start asking some of those issues of other players to say, actually, come on, if we're going to make a real difference, we've got to whack like it, to be honest. And that's all the partners. And everyone seems to me on board with this. We just know further down the chain, there's all sorts of reasons why this may not happen in the way that we want.
I think it would be absolutely great to get that endorsement from this committee. I think it is all about power. We talked about the absence of that strategically. I think it's difficult at the moment to assess a government policy around it so soon after the election, and hopefully that will give clarity and will reinforce some of the messaging that you've given, and then obviously that would be even stronger. We have worked with Ofsted, and I think it's important we continue that relationship, and the Mayor has written to all the London schools to talk to them about the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, but within that emphasise the importance of bringing down the numbers of exclusions. So I like the energy, I like the impatience. I'm quite impatient for that change as well, but I think it's also important that we do recognise that at the moment not all the power sits with us, so we've got to use the influence that we've got to try and drive that change.
Thank you.
Sorry, you wanted to come in?
It's just one very quick question, please. Can you tell me how much does it cost to run your units?
Not precisely off the top of my head, but it's yeah, no, I need to come back to you with a precise figure because I've not got that in front of me.
Okay, ballpark figure.
I think it's probably about 600,000, I would guess.
Yeah.
About 600,000, yeah.
Okay, can you write to the committee and tell us exactly how much with
sure.
all the overheads?
And by that you mean the costs in terms of employment costs and anything else, or?
Well, obviously the accommodation costs, all the overheads that it would actually cost to put your units in.
That that pays pretty much London minimum wage on all the staff that you've got. If
No, I meant
15
accommodation.
full-timers, and it comes to £600,000.
Well, I can assure you it's the London living wage payment, so...
possibly
and
be
her
right.
wages as well, yeah?
Can't possibly be right.
Before I ask Councillor Berry to come in, I'm told that there are 468 schools officers as of the end of last year.
It was more
so
than
more than
320.
300 and something. The target is 600 by the end of this financial year. So hopefully that will help you in your work with schools.
Yeah.
So I think it's such an important area. Councillor Berry, the last section.
Yes, just to ask about the governance and position of the VRU within London's organisations. The committee's been questioning from the start whether or not within MOPAC is the best place for it. The Mayor has said he would review it, that the Partnership Reference Group should give advice, and we asked if after a year it could be reviewed. So that's our question, really. Is within MOPAC the best place for the VRU to sit? Is it actually helpful to be there under their wing, or are there alternatives? I understand the other VRUs around the country, none of them sit within the PCC structures.
I mean, I think it is something that's being looked at. I think it's important that, nearly a year on, that's given a closer consideration. I would say that, MOPAC colleagues have been very helpful in terms of enabling us to spend some of the money, and they've got the structures there, and they've obviously got the, the HR there. So, that is one advantage. Certainly been an advantage for us being set up quite so quickly. But I think there's also perceptions about the unit that are really important, and there's practice around the country that makes the kind of independence and the long-term work and the association as the police as one of our partners but not the partner critical as well. That's not my decision.
Okay, so do you have an indication of when a review will conclude and make a decision?
Oh, I think fairly soon. Yeah, I think fairly soon. I mean, again, I'm not in charge of that review, so I can't give you a timeline, but that's definitely a live issue.
Has the Partnership Reference Group expressed an opinion? It's
No.
Independent?
No. I mean, the Partnership Reference Group has remained a very kind of strategic and energetic and involved group of people. It's expanded. So, we've got some more voices around the table, and they're very supportive, as you would expect, of the unit. And I think an indication, just a very obvious indication, but nonetheless quite an important one, is that you do see very senior members of those organisations coming, every single time, and you've not seen any kind of let up in that. So there's still a real desire and support for the VRU.
So finally, do you have anything to say about what the future looks like? You've been offered more funding today, I understand, by the Mayor, which presumably comes out of the business rates pot that we've talked about potentially coming forwards. You're going to grow. What do you have to say? What are you going to do?
I think it's been a tremendous sort of passion, actually, and privilege to be able to lead the unit over the last 11 months. I don't think there's an issue that is of more pressing concern. I think the notion of tackling it in a long-term way, evaluating the schemes that are there and trying to bring a partnership approach with communities at the heart of it is absolutely fundamental. So I think there's absolutely loads that we can continue doing, and I really look forward to being able to do it. And if we get the kind of assurance of funding, and we get, continue to make the right connections, I think we're in as good a place as any to really try and make some impact on something that's, tremendously devastating for many people across London.
We appreciate your offer to discuss and report back on the KPIs
Sure.
with us. We'll be progressing that, especially as you're now spending even more money.
Good.
Thank you. That was some 35 minutes longer than I envisaged. But clearly this is a very important project, and members, of course, had to ask you questions. So can I thank you, Lipak, and your Deputy Director, Karina Wen, for attending today. Can I ask colleagues to note the report and discussion with the Director of the and the Assistant Director of the Violence Reduction Unit? Thank you. And can we also agree to delegate authority to the Chair, myself, in consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon, MBAM, to agree any output from today's discussion? Thank you. Item 7, the Police and Crime Committee work program. Can I ask the committee to note the progress on our work program as set in the report? Thank you. And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for 4th of March 2020 at 10 a.m. in this room. And item 9, I have no other business, so I therefore close the meeting.
GLA, Chamber, Sound.